Chapter 1 of The Cave Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy LaFaro. The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1. Flotsam. The dim shadow of the thing was but a blur against the dim shadows of the wood behind it. The young man could distinguish no outline that might mark the presence as either brute or human. He could see no eyes, yet he knew that somewhere from out of that noiseless mass stealthy eyes were fixed upon him. This was the fourth time that the thing had crept out from the wood as darkness was settling. The fourth time during those 3 horrible weeks since he had been cast upon that lonely shore that he had watched terror-stricken while night engulfed the shadowy form that lurked at the forest's edge. It had never attacked him, but to his distorted imagination it seemed to slink closer and closer as night fell, waiting, always waiting for the moment that it might find him unprepared. Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones was not overly courageous. He had been taught to look with contempt upon all that savoured of muscular superiority. Such things were gross, brutal, primitive. It had been a giant intellect, only that he had craved, he and a fond mother, and their wishes had been fulfilled. At 21, Waldo was an animated encyclopedia, and about as muscular as a real one. Now he slunk, shivering with fright, at the very edge of the beach, as far from the grim forest as he could get. Cold sweat broke from every pore of his long, lank 6'2" body. His skinny arms and legs trembled as with palsy. Occasionally he coughed. It had been the cough that had banished him upon this ill-starred sea voyage. As he crouched in the sand, staring with wide, horror-dilated eyes into the black night, great tears rolled down his thin white cheeks. It was with difficulty that he restrained an overpowering desire to shriek. His mind was filled with forlorn regrets that he had not remained at home to meet the wasting death that the doctor had predicted. A peaceful death, at least, not the brutal end which faced him now. The lazy swell of the South Pacific lapped his legs, stretched upon the sand, for he had retreated before that menacing shadow as far as the ocean would permit. As the slow minutes dragged into age-long hours, the nervous strain told so heavily upon the weak boy that toward midnight he lapsed into merciful unconsciousness. The warm sun awoke him the following morning, but it brought with it but a faint renewal of courage. Things could not creep to his side unseen now, but still they could come, for the sun would not protect him. Even now some savage beast might be lurking just within the forest. The thought unnerved him to such an extent that he dared not venture to the woods for the fruit that had formed the major portion of his sustenance. Along the beach he picked up a few mouthfuls of sea-food, but that was all. The day passed as had the other terrible days which had preceded it, in scanning alternately the ocean and the forest's edge, the one for a ship and the other for the cruel death which he momentarily expected to see stalk out of the dreary shades to claim him. A more practical and a braver man would have constructed some manner of shelter in which he might have spent his nights in comparative safety and comfort. But Waldo Emerson's education had been conducted along lines of undiluted intellectuality, pursuits and knowledge which were practical were commonplace, and commonplaces were vulgar. It was preposterous that a Smith-Jones should ever have need of vulgar knowledge. For the 22nd time since the great wave had washed him from the steamer's deck and hurled him, choking and sputtering, upon this inhospitable shore, Waldo Emerson saw the sun sinking rapidly toward the western horizon. As it descended, the young man's terror increased, and he kept his eyes glued upon the spot from which the shadow had emerged the previous evening. He felt that he could not endure another night of the torture he had passed through 4 times before, that he should go mad, he was positive, and he recommenced to tremble and whimper even while daylight yet remained. For a time he tried turning his back to the forest, and then he sat huddled up gazing out upon the ocean, but the tears which rolled down his cheeks so blurred his eyes that he saw nothing. Finally he could endure it no longer, and with a sudden gasp of horror he wheeled toward the wood. There was nothing visible, yet he broke down and sobbed like a child, for loneliness and terror. When he was able to control his tears for a moment, he took the opportunity to scan the deepening shadows once more. At first glance brought a piercing shriek from his white lips. The thing was there! The young man did not fall grovelling to the sand this time. Instead, he stood staring with protruding eyes at the vague form, while shriek after shriek broke from his grinning lips. Reason was tottering. The thing, whatever it was, halted at the first blood-curdling cry, and then, when the cries continued, it slunk back toward the wood. With what remained of his ebbing mentality, Waldo Emerson realized that it were better to die at once than face the awful fears of the black night. He would rush to meet his fate, and thus end this awful agony of suspense. With the thought came action, so that, still shrieking, he rushed headlong toward the thing at the wood's rim. As he ran, it turned and fled into the forest, and after it went Waldo Emerson, his long, skinny legs carrying his emaciated body in great leaps and bounds through the tearing underbrush. He emitted shriek after shriek, ear-piercing shrieks that ended in long, drawn-out wails, more wolfish than human, and the thing that fled through the night before him was shrieking too now. Time and again the young man stumbled and fell. Thorns and brambles tore his clothing and his soft flesh. Blood smeared him from head to feet. Yet on and on he rushed through the semi-darkness of the now moonlit forest. At first impelled by the mad desire to embrace death and wrest the peace of oblivion from its cruel clutch, Waldo Emerson had come to pursue the screaming shadow before him from an entirely different motive. Now it was for companionship. He screamed now because of a fear that the thing would elude him, and that he should be left alone in the depths of this weird wood. Slowly but surely it was drawing away from him, and as Waldo Emerson realized the fact, he redoubled his efforts to overtake it. He had stopped screaming now, for the strain of his physical exertion found his weak lungs barely adequate to the needs of his gasping respiration. Suddenly the pursuit emerged from the forest to cross a little moonlit clearing, at the opposite side of which towered a high and rocky cliff. Toward this the fleeing creature sped, and in an instant more was swallowed apparently by the face of the cliff. Its disappearance was as mysterious and awesome as its identity had been, and left the young man in blank despair. With the object of pursuit gone, the reaction came, and Waldo Emerson sank trembling and exhausted at the foot of the cliff. A paroxysm of coughing seized him, and thus he lay in an agony of apprehension, fright, and misery, until from very weakness he sank into a deep sleep. It was daylight when he awoke, stiff, lame, sore, hungry, and miserable, but withal refreshed and sane. His first consideration was prompted by the craving of a starved stomach. Yet it was with the utmost difficulty that he urged his cowardly brain to direct his steps toward the forest, where hung fruit in abundance. At every little noise he halted in tense silence, poised to flee. His knees trembled so violently that they knocked together, but at length he entered the dim shadows, and presently was gorging himself with ripe fruits. To reach some of the more luscious viands, he had picked from the ground a piece of fallen limb, which tapered from a diameter of 4 inches at one end of the trifle over an inch at the other. It was the first practical thing that Waldo Emerson had done since he had been cast upon the shore of his new home. In fact, it was in all likelihood the nearest approximation to a practical thing which he had ever done in all his life. Waldo had never been allowed to read fiction, nor had he ever cared to so waste his time or impoverish his brain, and nowhere in the fund of deep erudition which he had accumulated could he recall any condition analogous to those which now confronted him. Waldo, of course, knew that there were such things as step-ladders, and had he had one, he would have used it as a means to reach the fruit above his hand's reach. But that he could knock the delicacies down with a broken branch seemed indeed a mighty discovery, a valuable addition to the sum total of human knowledge. Aristotle himself had never reasoned more logically. Waldo had taken the first step in his life toward independent mental action. Heretofore his ideas, his thoughts, his acts, even, had been borrowed from the musty writing of the ancients, or directed by the immaculate mind of his superior mother, and he clung to his discovery as a child clings to a new toy. When he emerged from the forest, he brought his stick with him. He determined to continue the pursuit of the creature that had eluded him the night before. It would, indeed, be curious to look upon a thing that feared him. In all his life he had never imagined it possible that any creature could flee from him in fear. A little glow suffused the young man as the idea timorously sought to take root. Could it be that there was a trace of swagger in that long, bony figure as Waldo directed his steps toward the cliff? Perish the thought! Pride in vulgar physical prowess! A long line of Smith-Joneses would have risen in their graves and rent their shrouds at the veriest hint of such an idea. For a long time Waldo walked back and forth along the foot of the cliff, searching for the avenue of escape used by the fugitive of yesternight. A dozen times he passed a well-defined trail that led winding up the cliff's face, but Waldo knew nothing of trails. He was looking for a flight of steps or a doorway. Finding neither, he stumbled by accident into the trail, and although the evident signs that marked it as such revealed nothing to him, yet he followed it upward for the simple reason that it was the only place upon the cliffside where he could find a foothold. Some distance up he came to a narrow cleft in the cliff into which the trail led. Rocks dislodged from above had fallen into it, and becoming wedged a few feet from the bottom, left only a small cave-like hole into which Waldo peered. There was nothing visible, but the interior was dark and forbidding. Waldo felt cold and clammy. He began to tremble. Then he turned and looked back toward the forest. The thought of another night spent within sight of that dismal place almost overcame him. No, 1,000 times no! Any fate were better than that, and so after several futile efforts he forced his unwilling body through the small aperture. He found himself on a path between two rocky walls, a path that rose before him at a steep angle. At intervals the blue sky was visible above through openings that had not been filled with debris. To another it would have been apparent that the cleft had been kept open by human beings, that it was a thoroughfare which was used, if not frequently, at least sufficiently often, to warrant considerable labour having been expended upon it to keep it free from the debris which must be constantly falling from above. Where the path led, or what he expected to find at the other end, Waldo had not the remotest idea. He was not an imaginative youth, but he kept up on the ascent in the hope that at the end he would find the creature which had escaped him the night before. As it had fled for a brief instant across the clearing beneath the moon's soft rays, Waldo had thought that it bore a remarkable resemblance to a human figure, but of that he could not be positive. At last his path broke suddenly into the sunlight. The walls on either side were but little higher than his head, and a moment later he emerged from the cleft onto a broad and beautiful plateau. Before him stretched a wide grassy plain, and beyond towered a range of mighty hills. Between them and him lay a belt of forest. A new emotion welled in the breast of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. It was akin to that which Balboa may have felt when he gazed for the first time upon the mighty Pacific from the Sierra de Quarequa. For the moment, as he contemplated this new and beautiful scene of rolling meadowland, distant forest, and serrated hilltops, he almost forgot to be afraid, and on the impulse of the instant he set out across the tableland to explore the unknown which lay beyond the forest. Well it was for Waldo Emerson's peace of mind that no faint conception of what lay there entered his unimaginative mind. To him, a land without civilization, without cities and towns, peopled by humans with manners and customs similar to those which obtain in Boston, was beyond belief. As he walked, he strained his eyes in every direction for some indication of human habitation, a fence, a chimney, anything that would be man-built, but his efforts were unrewarded. At the verge of the forest he halted, fearing to enter, but at last, when he saw that the wood was more open than that near the ocean, and that there was but little underbrush, he mustered sufficient courage to step timidly within. On careful tiptoe he threaded his way through the park-like grove, stopping every few minutes to listen, and ready at the first note of danger to fly screaming toward the open plain. Notwithstanding his fears, he reached the opposite boundary of the forest without seeing or hearing anything to arouse suspicion, and emerging from the cool shade, found himself a little distance from a perpendicular white cliff, the face of which was honeycombed with the mouths of many caves. There was no living creature in sight, nor did the very apparent artificiality of the caves suggest to the impractical Waldo that they might be the inhabitations of perhaps savage human beings. With the spell of discovery still upon him, he crossed the open toward the cliffs, but he had by no means forgotten his chronic state of abject fear. Ears and eyes were alert for hidden dangers, Every few steps were punctuated by a timid halt and a searching survey of his surroundings. It was during one of these halts, when he had crossed half the distance between the forest and the cliff, that he discerned a slight movement in the wood behind him. For an instant he stood staring and frozen, unable to determine whether he had been mistaken or really had seen a creature moving in the forest. He had about decided that he had but imagined a presence, when a great hairy brute of a man stepped suddenly from behind the bole of a tree. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The Wild People. The creature was naked, except for a bit of hide that hung from a leathern waist thong. If Waldo viewed the newcomer with wonder, it was no less than the wonder which the sight of him inspired in the breast of the hairy one, for what he saw was as truly remarkable to his eyes as was his appearance to those of the cultured Bostonian. And Waldo did indeed present a most startling exterior. His 6 feet 2 was accentuated by his extreme skinniness. His grey eyes looked weak and watery within the inflamed circles which rimmed them, and which had been produced by loss of sleep and much weeping. His yellow hair was tangled and matted, and streaked with dirt and blood. Blood stained his soiled and tattered ducks. His shirt was but a mass of frayed ribbons held to him at all only by the neckband. As he stood helplessly staring with bulging eyes at the awful figure glowering at him from the forest, his jaw dropped, his knees trembled, and he seemed about to collapse from sheer terror. Then the hideous man crouched and came creeping warily toward him. With an agonized scream, Waldo turned and fled toward the cliff. A quick glance over his shoulder brought another series of shrieks from the frightened fugitives, for it revealed not alone the fact that the awful man was pursuing him, but that behind him raced at least a dozen more equally frightful. Waldo ran toward the cliffs only because that direction lay straight away from his pursuers. He had no idea what he should do when he reached the rocky barrier. He was far too frightened to think. His pursuers were gaining upon him, their savage yells mingling with his piercing cries and spurring him on to undreamed-of pinnacles of speed. As he ran, his knees came nearly to his shoulders at each frantic bound. His left hand was extended far ahead, clutching wildly at the air as though he were endeavouring to pull himself ahead, while his right hand, still grasping the cudgel, described a rapid circle like the arm of a windmill gone mad. In action, Waldo was an inspiring spectacle. At the foot of the cliff he came to a momentary halt, while he glanced hurriedly about for a means of escape. But now he saw that the enemy had spread out toward the right and left, leaving no means of escape except up the precipitous side of the cliff. Up this narrow trails led steeply from ledge to ledge. In places, crude ladders scaled perpendicular heights from one tier of caves to the next above. But to Waldo the thing which confronted him seemed absolutely unscalable, and then another backward glance showed him the rapidly nearing enemy, and he launched himself at the face of that seemingly impregnable barrier, clutching desperately with fingers and toes. His progress was impeded by the cudgel, to which he still clung, but he did not drop it, though why it would have been difficult to tell, unless it was that his acts were not purely mechanical, there being no room in his mind for aught else than terror. Close behind him came the foremost caveman. Yet, though he had acquired the agility of a monkey through a lifetime of practice, he was amazed at the uncanny speed with which Waldo Emerson clawed his shrieking way aloft. Halfway up the ascent, however, a great hairy hand came almost to his ankle. It was during the perilous negotiation of one of the loose and wobbly ladders, little more than small trees leaning precariously against the perpendicular rocky surface, that the nearest foeman came so close to the fugitive. But at the top chance intervened to save Waldo, for a time at least. It was at the moment that he scrambled frantically to a tiny ledge from the frightfully slipping sapling. In his haste, he did by accident what a resourceful man would have done by intent. In pushing himself onto the ledge, he kicked the ladder outward. For a second it hung, toppling in the balance, and then with a lunge crashed down the cliff's face with its human burden, in its fall scraping others of the pursuing horde with it. A chorus of rage came up from below him, but Waldo had not even turned his head to learn of his temporary good fortune. Up, ever up he sped, until at length he stood upon the topmost ledge, facing an overhanging wall of blank rock that towered another 25 feet above him to the summit of the bluff. Time and again he leapt futilely against the smooth surface, tearing at it with his nails in a mad endeavour to climb still higher. At his right was the low opening to a black cave, but he did not see it. His mind could cope with but the single idea, to clamber from the horrible creatures which pursued him. But finally it was borne in on his half-mad brain that this was the end. He could fly no farther. Here, in a moment more, death would overtake him. He turned to meet it, and below saw a number of the cavemen placing another ladder in lieu of that which had fallen. In a moment they were resuming the ascent after him. On the narrow ledge above them the young man stood, chattering and grinning like a madman. His pitiful cries were not punctuated with the hollow coughing which his violent exercise had induced. Tears rolled down his begrimed face, leaving crooked, muddy streaks in their wake. His knees smote together so violently that he could barely stand, and it was into the face of this apparition of cowardice that the first of the cavemen looked as he scrambled above the ledge on which Waldo stood. And then, of a sudden, there rose within the breast of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones a spark that generations of over-refinement and emasculating culture had all but extinguished, the instinct of self-preservation by force. Heretofore it had been purely by flight. With the frenzy of the fear of death upon him, he raised his cudgel, and swinging it high above his head, brought it down full upon the unprotected skull of his enemy. Another took the fallen man's place. He, too, went down with a broken head. Waldo was fighting now like a cornered rat, and through it all he chattered and gibbered. But he no longer wept. At first he was horrified at the bloody havoc he wrought with his crude weapon. His nature revolted at the sight of blood, and when he saw it mixed with the matted hair along the side of his cudgel, and realized that it was human hair and human blood, and that he, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, had struck the blows that had plastered it there so thickly in all its hideousness, a wave of nausea swept over him, so that he almost toppled from his dizzy perch. For a few minutes there was a lull in hostilities, while the cavemen congregated below, shaking their fists at Waldo and crying out threats and challenges. The young man stood looking down upon them, scarcely able to realize that alone he had met savage men in physical encounter and defeated them. He was shocked and horrified, not, odd to say, because of the thing he had done, but rather because of a strange and unaccountable glow of pride in his brutal supremacy over brutes. What would his mother have thought could she have seen her precious boy now? Suddenly Waldo became conscious from the corner of his eye that something was creeping upon him from behind out of the dark cave before which he had fought. Simultaneously with the realization of it, he swung his cudgel in a wicked blow at this new enemy as he turned to meet it. The creature dodged back, and the blow that would have crushed its skull grazed a hairbreadth from its face. Waldo struck no second blow, and the cold sweat sprang to his forehead when he realized how nearly he had come to murdering a young girl. She crouched now in the mouth of the cave, eyeing him fearfully. Waldo removed his tattered cap, bowing low. "I crave your pardon," he said. "I had no idea that there was a lady here. I am very glad that I did not injure you." There must have been something either in his tone or manner that reassured her, for she smiled and came out upon the ledge beside him. As she did so, a scarlet flush mantled Waldo's face and neck and ears. He could feel them burning. With a nervous cough, he turned and became intently occupied with the distant scenery. Presently he cast a surreptitious glance behind him. Shocking! She was still there. Again he coughed nervously. "Excuse me," he said, "but, I am a total stranger, you know. Hadn't you better go back in and, get your clothes?" She made no reply, and so he forced himself to turn toward her once more. She was smiling at him. Waldo had never been so horribly embarrassed in all his life before. It was a distinct shock to him to realize that the girl was not embarrassed at all. He spoke to her a second time, and at last she answered, but in a tongue which he did not understand. It bore not the slightest resemblance to any language, modern or dead, with which he was familiar, and Waldo was more or less master of them all, especially the dead ones. He tried not to look at her after that, for he realized that he must appear very ridiculous. But now his attention was required by more pressing affairs. The cave men were returning to the attack. They carried stones this time, and while some of them threw the missiles at Waldo, the others attempted to rush his position. It was then that the girl hurried back into the cave, only to reappear a moment later, carrying some stone utensils in her arms. There was a huge mortar in which she had collected a pestle and several smaller pieces of stone. She pushed them along the ledge to Waldo. At first he did not grasp the meaning of her act, but presently she pretended to pick up an imaginary missile and hurl it down upon the creatures below. Then she pointed to the things she had brought and to Waldo. He understood. So she was upon his side. He did not understand why, but he was glad. Following her suggestion, he gathered up a couple of the smaller objects and hurled them down upon the men beneath. But on and on they came. Waldo was not a very good shot. The girl was busy now, gathering such of the cave's men's missiles as fell upon the ledge. These she placed in a pile beside Waldo. Occasionally the young man would strike an enemy by accident, and then she would give a little scream of pleasure, clapping her hands and jumping up and down. It was not long before Waldo was surprised to find that this applause fell sweetly upon his ears. It was then that he began to take better aim. In the midst of it there flashed suddenly upon him a picture of his devoted mother and the select coterie of intellectual young people with which she had always surrounded him. Waldo felt a new pang of horror as he tried to realize with what emotions they would look upon him now, as he stood upon the face of a towering cliff beside an almost naked girl, hurling rocks down upon the heads of hairy men who hopped about, screaming with rage, below him. It was awful. A great billow of mortification rolled over him. He turned to cast a look of disapprobation at the shameless young woman behind him. She should not think that he countenanced such coarse and vulgar proceedings. Their eyes met. In hers he saw the sparkle of excitement and the joy of life, and such a look of comradeship as he never before had seen in the eyes of another mortal. Then she pointed excitedly over the edge of the ledge. Waldo looked. A great brute of a cave-man had crawled unseen almost to their refuge. He was but 5 feet below them, and at the moment that he looked up, Waldo dropped a 50-pound stone mortar full upon his upturned face. The young woman emitted a little shriek of joy, and Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, his face bisected by a broad grin, turned toward her. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Little Eden. The mortar ended hostilities, temporarily at least, but the cavemen loitered about the base of the cliff during the balance of the afternoon, occasionally shouting taunts at the two above them. These the girls answered, evidently in kind. Sometimes she would point to Waldo and make ferocious signs, doubtless indicative of the horrible slaughter which awaited them at his hands if they did not go away and leave their betters alone. When the young man realized the significance of her pantomime, he felt his heart swell with an emotion which he feared was pride in brutal, primitive, vulgar, physical prowess. As the long day wore on, Waldo became both very hungry and very thirsty. In the valley below, he could see a tiny brooklet purling, clear and beautiful, toward the south. The sight of it drove him nearly mad, as did also that of the fruit which he glimpsed hanging ripe for eating at the edge of the forest. By means of signs he asked the girl if she too were hungry, for he had come to a point now where he could look at her almost without visible signs of mortification. She nodded her head, and pointing toward the descending sun, made it plain to him that after dark they would descend and eat. The cavemen had not left when darkness came, and it seemed to Waldo a very foolhardy thing to venture down while they might be about. But the girl made it so evident that she considered him an invincible warrior, that he was torn with the conflicting emotions of cowardice and an unaccountable desire to appear well in her eyes, that he might, by his acts, justify her belief in him. It seemed very wonderful to Waldo that anyone should look upon him in the light of a tower of strength and a haven of refuge. He was not quite certain in his own mind, but that the reputation might lead him into most uncomfortable and embarrassing situations. Incidentally, he wondered if the girl was a good runner. He hoped so. It must have been quite near midnight when his companion intimated that the time had arrived when they should fare forth and dine. Waldo wanted her to go first, but she shrank close to him timidly and held back. There was nothing else for it, then, than to take the plunge, though had the sun been shining it would have revealed a very pale and wide-eyed champion, who slipped gingerly over the side of the ledge to grope with his feet for a foothold beneath. Halfway down, the moon rose above the forest, a great, full, tropic moon that lighted the face of the cliff almost as brilliantly as might the sun itself. It shone into the mouth of a cave upon the ledge that Waldo had just reached in his descent, revealing to the horrified eyes of the young man a great hairy form stretched in slumber not a yard from him. As he looked, the wicked little eyes opened and looked straight into his. With difficulty, Waldo suppressed a shriek of dismay as he turned to plunge madly down the precipitous trail. The girl had not yet descended from the ledge above. She must have sensed what had happened, for as Waldo turned to fly, she gave a little cry of terror. At the same instant the cave-man leapt to his feet, but the girl's voice had touched something in the breast of Waldo Emerson, which generations of disuse had almost atrophied, and for the first time in his life he did a brave and courageous thing. He could easily have escaped the cave-man and reached the valley alone, but at the first note of the young girl's cry, he wheeled and scrambled back to the ledge to face the burly primitive man, who could have crushed him with a single blow. Waldo Emerson no longer trembled. His nerves and muscles were very steady as he swung his cudgel in an arc that brought it crashing down upon the upraised guarding arm of the cave-man. There was a snapping of bone beneath the blow, a scream of pain. The man staggered back. The girl sprang to Waldo's side from the ledge above, and hand in hand they turned and fled down the face of the cliff. From a dozen cave mouths above issued a score of cavemen, but the fleeing pair were halfway across the clearing before the slow-witted brutes were fully aware of what had happened. By the time they had taken up the pursuit, Waldo and the girl had entered the forest. For a few yards the latter led Waldo straight into the shadows of the wood. Then she turned abruptly toward the north, at right angles to the course they had been pursuing. She still clung to the young man's hand, nor did she slacken her speed the least after they had entered the darkness beneath the trees. She ran as surely and confidently through the impenetrable fright of the forest as though the way had been lighted by flaming arcs. But Waldo was continually stumbling and falling. The sound of pursuit presently became fainter. It was apparent that the cavemen had continued on straight into the wood, but the girl raced on with the panting Waldo for what seemed to the winded young man an eternity. Presently, however, they came to the banks of the little stream that had been visible from the caves. Here the girl fell into a walk, and a moment later dragged the Bostonian down a shelving bank into water that came above his knees. Up the bed of the stream she led him, sometimes floundering through the holes so deep that they were entirely submerged. Waldo had never learned the vulgar art of swimming, so it was that he would have drowned but for the strong brown hand of his companion, which dragged him spluttering and coughing through one awful hole after another, until, half strangled and entirely panic-stricken, she hauled him safely upon a low grassy bank at the foot of a rocky wall which formed one side of a gorge, through which the river boiled. It must not be assumed that when Waldo Emerson returned to face the hairy brute who threatened to separate him from his new-found companion, that by a miracle he had been transformed from a hare into a lion. Far from it. Now that he had a moment in which to lie quiet still and speculate upon the adventures of the past hour, the reaction came, and Waldo Emerson thanked the kindly night that obscured from the eyes of the girl the pitiable spectacle of his palsied limbs and trembling lip. Once again he was in a blue funk, with shattered nerves that begged to cry aloud in the extremity of their terror. It was not warm in the damp canyon, through which the wind swept over the cold water, so that to Waldo's mental anguish was added the physical discomfort of cold and wet. He was indeed a miserable figure as he lay huddled upon the sward, praying for the rising of the sun, yet dreading the daylight that might reveal him to his enemies. But at last dawn came, and after a fitful sleep Waldo awoke to find himself in a snug and beautiful little paradise hemmed in by the high cliffs that flanked the river, upon a sloping grassy shore that was all but invisible except from a short stretch of cliff-top upon the farther side of the stream. A few feet from him lay the girl. She was still asleep. Her head was pillowed upon one firm brown arm. Her soft black hair fell in disorder across one cheek and over the other arm, to spread gracefully upon the green grass about her. As Waldo looked, he saw that she was very comely. Never before had he seen a girl just like her. His young women friends had been rather prim and plain, with long, white faces and thin lips that scarcely ever dared to smile and scorned to unbend in plebeian laughter. This girl's lips seemed to have been made for laughing, and for something else, though at the time it is only fair to Waldo to say that he did not realize the full possibilities that they presented. As his eyes wandered along the lines of her young body, his puritanical training brought a hot flush of embarrassment to his face, and he deliberately turned his back upon her. It was indeed awful to Waldo Emerson to contemplate, to say the least, the unconventional position into which fate had forced him. The longer he pondered it, the redder he became. It was frightful. What would his mother say when she heard of it? What would this girl's mother say? But more to the point, and horrible thought, what would her father and her brothers do to Waldo if they found them thus together, and she with only a scanty garment of skin about her waist, a garment which reached scarcely below her knees at any point, and at others terminated far above? Waldo was chagrined. He could not understand what the girl could be thinking of, for in other respects she seemed quite nice, and he was sure that the great eyes of her reflected only goodness and innocence. While he sat thus thinking, the girl awoke, and with a merry laugh addressed him. "Good morning," said Waldo quite severely. He wished that he could speak her language, so that he could convey to her a suggestion of the disapprobation which he felt for her attire. He was on the point of attempting it by signs, when she rose, lithe and graceful as a tigress, and walked to the river's brim. With a deft movement of her fingers, she loosed the thong that held her single garment, and as it fell to the ground, Waldo, with a horrific gasp, turned upon his face, burying his tightly closed eyes in his hands. Then the girl dived into the cool waters of her matutinal bath. She called to him several times to join her, but Waldo could not look at the spectacle presented. His soul was scandalized. It was some time after she emerged from the river before he dared risk a hesitating glance. With a sigh of relief, he saw that she had donned her single garment, and thereafter he could look at her unashamed when she was thus clothed. He felt that by comparison it constituted a most modest gown. Together they strolled along the river's edge, gathering such fruits and roots as the girl knew to be edible. Waldo Emerson gathered those she indicated. With all his learning, he found it necessary to depend upon the untutored mind of this little primitive maiden for guidance. Then she taught him how to catch fish with a bent twig and a lightning-like movement of her brown hands, or rather tried to teach him, for he was far too slow and awkward to succeed. Afterward they sat upon the soft grass beneath the shade of a wild fig tree to eat the fish she had caught. Waldo wondered how in the world the girl could make fire without matches, for he was quite sure that she had none. And even should she be able to make fire, it would be quite useless, since she had neither cooking utensils nor stove. He was not left long in wonderment. She arranged the fish in a little pile between them, and with a sweet smile motioned to the man to partake. Then she selected one for herself, and while Waldo Emerson looked on in horror, sunk her firm white teeth into the raw fish. Waldo turned away in sickening disgust. The girl seemed surprised and worried that he did not eat. Time and again she tried to coax him by signs to join her, but he could not even look at her. He had tried after the first wave of revolt had subsided, but when he discovered that she ate the entire fish without bothering to clean it or remove the scales, he became too ill to think of food. Several times during the following week they ventured from their hiding place, and at these times it was evident from the girl's actions that she was endeavoring to elude their enemies and reach a place of safety other than that in which they were concealed. But at each venture her quick ears or sensitive nostrils warned her of the proximity of danger, so that they had been compelled to hurry back into their little Eden. During this period she taught Waldo many words of her native tongue, so that by means of signs to bridge the gaps between, they were able to communicate with a fair degree of satisfaction. Waldo's mastery of the language was rapid. On the 10th day the girl was able to make him understand that she wished to escape with him to her own people, that these men among whom he had found her were enemies of her tribe, and that she had been hiding from them when Waldo stumbled upon her cave. "I fled," she said. "My mother was killed. My father took another mate, always cruel to me. But when I had wandered into the land of these enemies, I was afraid, and would have returned to my father's cave, but I had gone too far. I would have to run very fast to escape them. Once I ran down a narrow path to the ocean. It was dark. As I wandered through the woods, I came suddenly out upon a beach, and there I saw a strange figure on the sand. It was you. I wanted to learn what manner of man you were, but I was very much afraid, so that I dared only watch you from a distance. 5 times I came down to look at you. You never saw me until the last time. Then you set out after me, roaring in a horrible voice. I was very much afraid, for I knew that you must be very brave to live all alone by the edge of the forest without any shelter or even a stone to hurl at Nagula, should he come out of the woods to devour you." "Who is Nagula?" he asked. "You do not know Nagula?" the girl exclaimed in surprise. "Not by that name," replied Waldo. "He is as large," she began in description, "as 2 men, and black, with glossy coat. He has 2 yellow eyes, which see as well by night as by day. His great paws are armed with mighty claws. He—" A rustling from the bushes which fringed the opposite cliff top caused her to turn, instantly alert. "Ah," she whispered, "there is Nagula now." Waldo looked in the direction of her gaze. It was well that the girl did not see his pallid face and popping eyes as he looked into the evil mask of the great black panther that crouched watching them from the river's further bank. Into Waldo's breast came great panic. It was only because his fear-prostrated muscles refused to respond to his will that he did not scurry screaming from the sight of that ferocious countenance. Then, through the fog of his cowardly terror, he heard again the girl's sweet voice. "I knew that you must be very brave to live all alone by the edge of that wicked forest." For the first time in his life, a wave of shame swept over Waldo Emerson. The girl called in a taunting voice to the panther, and then turned, smiling, toward Waldo. "How brave I am now!" she laughed. "I am no longer afraid of Nagula. You are with me." "No," said Waldo Emerson in a very weak voice. "You need not fear while I am with you." "Oh!" she cried, "slay him! How proud I should be to return to my people with one who vanquished Nagula, and wore his hide about his loins as proof of his prowess." Yes," acquiesced Waldo faintly. "But," continued the girl, "you have slain many of Nagula's brothers and sisters. It is no longer sport to kill one of his kind." "Yes, yes," cried Waldo. "Yes, that is it. Panthers bore me now." "Oh!" The girl clasped her hands in ecstasy. "How many have you slain?" Why, let me see," the young man blundered. "As a matter of fact, I never kept any record of the panthers I killed." Waldo was becoming frantic. He had never lied before in all his life. He hated a lie, and loathed a liar. He wondered why he had lied now. Surely it were nothing to boast of to have butchered one of God's creatures. And as for claiming to have killed so many that he could not recall the number, it was little short of horrible. Yet he became conscious of a poignant regret that he had not killed 1,000 panthers, and preserved all the pelts as evidence of his valor. The panther still regarded them from the safety of the farther shore. The girl drew quite close to Waldo in the instinctive plea for protection that belongs to her sex. She laid a timid hand upon his skinny arm and raised her great, trusting eyes to his face in reverent adoration. "How do you kill them?" she whispered. "Tell me." Then it was that Waldo determined to make a clean breast of it, and admit that he never before had seen a live panther. But as he opened his mouth to make the humiliating confession, he realized quite suddenly why it was that he had lied. He wished to appear well in the eyes of this savage, half-clothed girl. He, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, craved the applause of a barbarian, and to win it had simulated that physical prowess which generations of Smith-Joneses had viewed from afar, disgusted, disapproving. The girl repeated her question. "Oh," said Waldo, "it is really quite simple. After I catch them, I beat them severely with a stick." The girl sighed. "How wonderful!" she said. Waldo became the victim of a number of unpleasant emotions: mortification for this suddenly developed moral turpitude, apprehension for the future, when the girl might discover him in his true colors, fear, consuming, terrible fear, that she might insist upon his going forth at once to slay Nagula. But she did nothing of the kind, and presently the panther tired of watching them and turned back into the tangle of bushes behind him. It was with a sigh of relief that Waldo saw him depart. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Death's Doorway. Late in the afternoon, the girl suggested that they start that night upon the journey toward her village. "The bad men will not be abroad after dark," she said. "With you at my side, I shall not fear Nagula." "How far is it to your village?" asked Waldo. "It will take us 3 nights," she replied. "By day we must hide, for even you could not vanquish a great number of bad men should they attack you at once." "No," said Waldo, "I presume not." "It was very wonderful to watch you, though," she went on, "when you battled upon the cliffside, beating them down as they came upon you. How brave you were! How terrible! You trembled from rage." "Yes," admitted Waldo, "I was quite angry. I always tremble like that when my ire is excited. Sometimes I get so bad that my knees knock together. If you ever see them do that, you will realize how exceedingly angry I am." "Yes," murmured the girl. Presently Waldo saw that she was laughing quietly to herself. A great fear arose in his breast. Could it be that she was less gullible than she had appeared? Did she, after all, penetrate the bombast with which he had sought to cloak his cowardice? He finally mustered sufficient courage to ask, "Why do you laugh?" "I think of the surprise that awaits old Flatfoot and Corth and the others when I lead you to them." "Why will they be surprised?" asked Waldo. "At the way you will crack their heads." Waldo shuddered. "Why should I crack their heads?" he asked. "Why should you crack their heads?" It was apparently incredible to the girl that he should not understand. "How little you know," she said. "You cannot swim. You do not know the language which men may understand. You would be lost in the woods were I to leave you. And now you say that you do not know that when you come to a strange tribe they will try to kill you, and only take you as one of them when you have proven your worth by killing at least one of their strongest men." "At least one," said Waldo half to himself. He was dazed by this information. He had expected to be welcomed with open arms into the best society that the girls' community afforded. He had thought of it in just this way, for he had not even yet learned that there might be a whole people living under entirely different conditions than those which existed in Boston, Massachusetts. Her reference to his ignorance also came as a distinct shock to him. He had always considered himself a man of considerable learning. It had been his secret boast and his mother's open pride. And now to be pitied for his ignorance by one who probably thought the earth flat, if she ever thought about such matters at all, by one who could neither read nor write. And the worst of it all was that her indictment was correct, only she had not gone far enough. There was little of practical value that he did know. With the realization of his limitations, Waldo Emerson took, unknown to himself, a great stride toward a broader wisdom than his narrow soul ever had conceived. That night, after the sun had set and the stars and moon came out, the two set forth from their retreat toward the northwest, where the girl said that the village of her people lay. They walked hand in hand through the dark wood, the girl directing their steps, the young man grasping his long cudgel in his right hand, and searching into the shadows for the terrible creatures conjured by his cowardly brain, but mostly for the two awesome spots of fire which he had gathered from the girl's talk would mark the presence of Nagoula. Strange noises assailed his ears, and once the girl crouched close to him as her quick ears caught the sound of the movement of a great body through the underbrush at their left. Waldo Emerson was almost paralyzed by terror, but at length the creature, whatever it may have been, turned off into the forest without molesting them. For several hours thereafter they suffered no alarm, but the constant tension of apprehension on the man's already overwrought nerves had reduced him to a state of such abject nervous terror that he was no longer master of himself. So it was that when the girl suddenly halted him with an affrighted little gasp, and, pointing straight ahead, whispered, "Nagoula," he went momentarily mad with fear. For a bare instant he paused in his tracks, and then, breaking away from her, he raised his club above his head, and, with an awful shriek, dashed straight toward the panther. In the minds of some there may be a doubt as to which of the two, the sleek, silent black cat, or the grinning, screaming Waldo, was the most awe-inspiring. Be that as it may, it was quite evident that no doubt assailed the mind of the cat, for with a single answering scream he turned and faded into the blackness of the black night. But Waldo did not see him go. Still shrieking, he raced on through the forest until he tripped over a creeper and fell exhausted to the earth. There he lay, panting, twitching, and trembling until the girl found him an hour after sunrise. At the sound of her voice, he would have struggled to his feet and dashed on into the woods, for he felt that he could never face her again after the spectacle of cowardice with which he had treated her a few hours before. But even as he gained his feet, her first words reassured him and dissipated every vestige of his intention to elude her. "Did you catch him?" she cried. "No," panted Waldo Emerson, quite truthfully. "He got away." They rested a little while, and then Waldo insisted that they resume their journey by day instead of by night. He had positively determined that he never should or could endure another such a night of mental torture. He would much rather take the chance of meeting with the bad men than suffer the constant feeling that unseen enemies were peering out of the darkness at him every moment. In the day they would at least have the advantage of seeing their foes before they were struck. He did not give these reasons to the girl, however. Under the circumstances, he felt that another explanation would be better adapted to her ears. "You see," he said, "if it hadn't been so dark, Nagula might not have escaped me. It is too bad, too bad." "Yes," agreed the girl, "it is too bad. We shall travel by day." "It will be safe now. We have left the country of the bad men, and there are few men living between us and my people." That night they spent in a cave they found in the steep bank of a small river. It was damp and muddy and cold, but they were both very tired, and so they fell asleep, and slept as soundly as though the best of mattresses lay beneath them. The girl probably slept better, since she had never been accustomed to anything much superior to this in all her life. The journey required 5 days instead of 3, and during all the time Waldo was learning more and more woodcraft from the girl. At first his attitude had been such that he could profit but little from her greater practical knowledge, for he had been inclined to look down upon her as an untutored savage. Now, however, he was a willing student, and when Waldo Emerson elected to study, there was nothing that he could not master and retain in a remarkable manner. He had a well-trained mind, the principal trouble with it being that it had been crammed full of useless knowledge. His mother had always made the error of confusing knowledge with wisdom. Waldo was not the only one to learn new things upon this journey. The girl learned something too, something which had been threatening for days to rise above the threshold of her conscious mind, and now she realized that it had lain in her heart almost ever since the first moment that she had been with this strange young man. Waldo Emerson had been endowed by nature with a chivalrous heart, and his training had been such that he mechanically accorded to all women the gallant little courtesies and consideration which are of the fine things that go with breeding. Nor was he one whit less punctilious in his relations with this wild cave girl than he would have been with the daughter of the finest family of his own aristocracy. He had been kind and thoughtful and sympathetic always, and to the girl, who had never been accustomed to such treatment from men, nor had ever seen a man accord it to any woman, it seemed little short of miraculous that such gentle tenderness could belong to a nature so warlike and ferocious as that with which she had endowed Waldo Emerson. But she was quite satisfied that it should be so. She would not have cared for him had he been gentle with her, yet cowardly. Had she dreamed of the real truth? Had she had the slightest suspicion that Waldo Emerson was at heart the most arrant poltroon upon whom the sun had ever shone, she would have loathed and hated him. For in the primitive code of ethics which governed the savage community which was her world, there was no place for the craven or the weakling, and Waldo Emerson was both. As the realization of her growing sentiment toward the man awakened, it imparted to her ways with him a sudden coyness and maidenly aloofness which had been entirely wanting before. Until then, their companionship, in so far as the girl was concerned, had been rather that of one youth toward another. But now that she found herself thrilling at his slightest careless touch, she became aware of a paradoxical impulse to avoid him. For the first time in her life, too, she realized her nakedness, and was ashamed. Possibly this was due to the fact that Waldo appeared so solicitous in endeavoring to coerce his rags into the impossible feat of entirely covering his body. As they neared their journey's end, Waldo became more and more perturbed. During the last night, horrible visions of Flatfoot and Corth haunted his dreams. He saw the great hairy beasts rushing upon him in all the ferocity of their primeval savagery, tearing him limb from limb in their bestial rage. With a shriek he awoke. To the girl's startled inquiry, he replied that he had been but dreaming. "Did you dream of Flatfoot and Corth?" she laughed. "Of the things that you will do to them tomorrow?" "Yes," replied Waldo, "I dreamed of Flatfoot and Corth." But the girl did not see how he trembled and hid his head in the hollow of his arm. The last day's march was the most agonizing experience of Waldo Emerson's life. He was positive that he was going to his death, but to him the horror of the thing lay more in the manner of his coming death than in the thought of death itself. As a matter of fact, he had again reached a point when he would have welcomed death. The future held for him nothing but a life of discomfort and misery and constant mental anguish, superinduced by the condition of awful fear under which he must drag out his existence in this strange and terrible land. Waldo had not the slightest conception as to whether he was upon some mainland or an unknown island. That the tidal wave had come upon them somewhere in the South Pacific was all that he knew, but long since he had given up hope that succor would reach him in time to prevent him perishing miserably far from his home and his poor mother. He could not dwell long upon this dismal theme, because it always brought tears of self-pity to his eyes, and for some unaccountable reason Waldo shrunk from the thought of exhibiting such unmanly weakness before the girl. All day long he racked his brain for some valid excuse whereby he might persuade his companion to lead him elsewhere than to her village. 1,000 times better would be some secluded little garden, such as that which had harbored them for the 10 days following their escape from the cavemen. If they could but come upon such a place near the coast, where Waldo could keep a constant watch for passing vessel, he would have been as happy as he ever expected it would be possible for him in such a savage land. He wanted the girl with him for companionship. He was more afraid when he was alone. Of course he realized that size was no fit companion for a man of his mental attainments, but then she was a human being, and her society much better than none at all. While hope had still lingered that he might live to escape and return to his beloved Boston, he had often wondered whether he would dare tell his mother of his unconventional acquaintance with this young woman. Of course, it would be out of the question for him to go at all into details. He would not, for example, dare to attempt a description of her toilet to his prim parent. The fact that they had been alone together day and night for weeks was another item which troubled Waldo considerably. He knew that the shock of such information might prostrate his mother, and for a long time he debated the wisdom of omitting any mention of the girl whatever. At length he decided that a little white lie would be permissible, inasmuch as his mother's health and the girl's reputation were both at stake. So he had decided to mention that the girl's aunt had been with them in the capacity of chaperone. That fixed it nicely, and on this point Waldo's mind was more at ease. Late in the afternoon they wound down a narrow trail that led them from the plateau into a narrow, beautiful valley. A tree-bordered river meandered through the centre of the level plain that formed the valley's floor, while beyond rose precipitous cliffs, which trailed off in either direction as far as the eye could reach. "There live my people," said the girl, pointing toward the distant barrier. Waldo groaned inwardly. "Let us rest here," he said, "until tomorrow, that we may come to your home rested and refreshed." "Oh, no!" cried the girl. "We can reach the caves before dark." "I can scarcely wait until I shall have seen how you shall slay Flatfoot, and maybe Corth also. Though I think that after one of them has felt your might, the others will be glad to take you into the tribe at the price of your friendship." "Is there not some way," ventured the distracted Waldo, "that I may come into your village without fighting? I should dislike to kill one of your friends," said Waldo solemnly. The girl laughed. "Neither Flatfoot nor Corth are friends of mine," she replied. "I hate them both. They are terrible men. It would be better for all of the tribe were they killed. They are so strong and cruel that we all hate them, since they use their strength to abuse those who are weaker. They make us all work very hard for them. They take other men's mates, and if the other men object, they kill them. There is scarcely a moon passes that does not see either Corth or Flatfoot kill someone. Nor is it always men they kill. Often, when they are angry, they kill women and little children just for the pleasure of killing. But when you come among us, there will be no more of that, for you will kill them both if they be not good." Waldo was too horrified by this description of his soon-to-be antagonists to make any reply. His tongue clave to the roof of his mouth. All his vocal organs seemed paralyzed. But the girl did not notice. She went on joyously, ripping Waldo's nervous system out of him and tearing it into shreds. "You see," she continued, "Flatfoot and Corth are greater than the other men of my tribe. They can do as they will. They are frightful to look upon, and I have often thought that the hearts of others dried up when they saw either of them coming for them. And they are so strong! I have seen Corth crush the skull of a full-grown man with a single blow from his open palm, while one of Flatfoot's amusements is the breaking of men's arms and legs with his bare hands." They had entered the valley now, and in silence they continued on toward the fringe of trees which grew beside the little river. Nadara led the way toward a ford, which they quickly crossed. All the way across the valley Waldo had been searching for some avenue of escape. He dared not enter that awful village and face those terrible men, and he was almost equally averse to admitting to the girl that he was afraid. He would gladly have died to have escaped either alternative, but he preferred to choose the manner of his death. The thought of entering the village and meeting a horrible end at the hands of the brutes who awaited him there, and of being compelled to demonstrate before the girl's eyes, that he was neither a mighty fighter nor a hero was more than he could endure. Occupied with these harrowing speculations, Waldo and Nadara came to the farther side of the forest, whence they could see the towering cliffs rising steeply from the valley's bed, 300 yards away. Along their face and at their feet, Waldo descried a host of half-naked men, women, and children moving about in the consummation of their various duties. Involuntarily he halted. The girl came to his side. Together they looked out upon the scene, the like of which Waldo Emerson never before had seen. It was as though he had been suddenly snatched back through countless ages to a long dead past, and dropped into the midst of the prehistoric life of his Paleolithic progenitors. Upon the narrow ledges before their caves, women with long flowing hair ground food in rude stone mortars. Naked children played about them, perilously close to the precipitous cliff edge. Hairy men squatted, gorilla-like, before pieces of flat stone, upon which green hides were stretched, while they scraped with the sharp edge of smaller bits of stone. There was no laughter and no song. Occasionally Waldo saw one of the fierce creatures address another, and sometimes one would raise his thick lips in a nasty snarl that exposed his fighting fangs. But they were too far away for their words to reach the young man. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Awakening. "Come," said the girl, "let us make haste. I cannot wait to be home again. How good it looks!" Waldo gazed at her in horror. It did not seem credible that this beautiful young creature could be of such clay as that he looked upon. It was revolting to believe that she had sprung from the loins of one of those half-brutes, or that a woman as fierce, repulsive, such as those he saw before him, could have borne her. It made him sick with disgust. He turned from her. "Go to your people, Nadara," he said, for an idea had come to him. He had evolved a scheme for escaping a meeting with Flatfoot and Corth, and the sudden disgust which he felt for the girl made it easier for him to carry out his design. "Are you not coming with me?" she cried. "Not at once," replied Waldo, quite truthfully. "I wish you to go first. Were we to go together, they might harm you when they rushed out to attack me." The girl had no fear of this, but she felt that it was very thoughtful of the man to consider her welfare so tenderly. To humour him, she acceded to his request. "As you wish, Thandar," she answered, smiling. Thandar was a name of her own choosing, after Waldo had informed her in his answer to a request for his name that she might call him Mr. Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. "I shall call you Thandar," she had replied. "It is shorter, more easily remembered, and describes you. It means the brave one." And so Thandar he had become. The girl had scarcely emerged from the forest on her way toward the cliffs when Thandar the brave one turned and ran at top speed in the opposite direction. When he came to the river, he gave immediate evidence of the strides he had taken in woodcraft during the brief weeks that he had been under the girl's tutorage, for he plunged immediately into the water, setting out upstream upon the gravelly bottom, where he would leave no spur to be tracked down by the eagle eyes of these primitive men. He supposed that the girl would search for him, but he felt no compunction at having deserted her so scurvily, Of course, he had no suspicion of her real sentiments toward him. It would have shocked him to have imagined that a low-born person such as she had become infatuated with him. It would have been embarrassing and unfortunate, but, of course, quite impossible, since Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones could never form an alliance beneath him. As for the girl herself, he might as readily have considered the possibility of marrying a cow. So far from any such thoughts of her had he been. On and on he stumbled through the cold water. Sometimes it was above his head, but Waldo had learned to swim. The girl had made him, partly by pleas, but largely by the fear that she would ridicule him. As night came on, he commenced to become afraid, but his fear now was not such a horribly prostrating thing as it had been a few weeks before. Without being aware of the fact, Waldo had grown a trifle less timid, though he was still far from lion-like. That night he slept in the crotch of a tree. He selected a small one, which, though less comfortable, was safer from the approach of Ngula than a larger tree would have been. This also had he learned from Nadara. Had he paused to consider, he would have discovered that all he knew that was worth while he had had from the savage little girl whom he, from the high pinnacle of his erudition, regarded with such pity. But Waldo had not as yet learned enough to realize how very little he knew. In the morning he continued his flight, gathering his breakfast from tree and shrub as he fled. Here again was he wholly indebted to Nadara, for without her training he would have been restricted to a couple of fruits, whereas now he had a great variety of fruits, roots, berries, and nuts to choose from in safety. The stream that he had been following had now become a narrow, rushing mountain torrent. It leapt suddenly over little precipices in wild and picturesque waterfalls. It rioted in foaming cascades, and ever it led Waldo farther into high and rugged country. The climbing was difficult and oftentimes dangerous. Waldo was surprised at the steeps he negotiated, perilous ascents from which he would have shrunk in palsied fear a few weeks earlier. Waldo was coming on. Another fact which struck him with amazement at the same time that it filled him with rejoicing was that he no longer coughed. It was quite beyond belief, too, since never in his life had he been so exposed to cold and wet and discomfort. At home, he realized, he would long since have curled up and died had he been subjected to 1/10 the exposure that he had undergone since the great wave had lifted him bodily from the deck of the steamer to land him unceremoniously in the midst of this new life of hardships and terrors. Toward noon, Waldo began to travel with less haste. He had seen or heard no evidence of pursuit. At times he stopped to look back along the trail he had passed, but though he could see the little valley below him for a considerable distance, he discovered nothing to arouse alarm. Presently he realized that he was very lonely. A dozen times in as many minutes he thought of observations he would have been glad to make had there been some one with him to hear. There were queries, too, relative to this new country that he should have liked very much to propound, and it flashed upon him that in all the world there was only one whom he knew who could give him correct answers to these queries. He wondered what the girl had thought when he did not follow her into the village, and set upon Flatfoot and Corth. At the thought he found himself flushing in a most unaccountable manner. What would the girl think? Would she guess the truth? Well, what difference if she did? What was her opinion to a cultured gentleman such as Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. But yet he found his mind constantly reverting to this unhappy speculation. It was most annoying. As he thought of her, he discovered with what distinctness he recalled every feature of her piquant face, her olive skin tinged beautifully by the ruddy glow of health, her fine straight nose and delicate nostrils, her perfect eyes, soft, yet filled with the fire of courage and intelligence. Waldo wondered why it was that he recalled these things now, and dwelt upon them. He had been with her for weeks without realizing that he had particularly noticed them. But most vividly he conjured again the memory of her soft, liquid speech, her ready retorts, her bright, interesting observations on the little happenings of their daily life, her thoughtful kindliness to him, a stranger within her gates, and again he flushed hotly, her sincere though remarkable belief in his prowess. It took Waldo a long time to admit to himself that he missed the girl. It must have been weeks before he finally did so unreservedly. Simultaneously he determined to return to her village and find her. He had even gone so far as to start the return journey when the memory of her description of Flatfoot and Corth brought him to a sudden halt, a most humiliating halt. The blood surged to his face. He could feel it burning there. And then Waldo did two things which he had never done before. He looked at his soul and saw himself as he was, and he swore. "Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones," he said aloud, "you're a darned coward. Worse than that, you're an unthinkable cad. The girl was kind to you. She treated you with the tender solicitude of a mother. And how have you returned her kindness? By looking down upon her with arrogant condescension, by pitying her. Pitying her! You miserable weakling, ingrate, pitying that fine, intelligent, generous girl, you with your pitiful little store of second-hand knowledge, pitying that girl's ignorance. Why, she's forgotten more real things than you ever heard of. You Words utterly failed him. Waldo's awakening was thorough, painfully thorough. It left no tiny hidden recess of his contemptible little soul unrevealed from his searching self-analysis. Looking back over the 21 years of his uneventful life, he failed to resurrect but a single act of which he might not be proud, and that, strange to say, in the light of his past training, had to do neither with culture, intellect, birth, breeding, nor knowledge. It was a pure, gross, physical act. It was hideously, violently, repulsively animal. It was no other than the instant of heroism in which he had turned back upon the cliff's face to battle with the horrible hairy man who had threatened to prevent Nadara's escape. Even now Waldo could not realize that it had been he who ventured so foolhardy an act, but none the less his breast swelled with pride as he recalled it. It put into the heart of the man a new hope, and into his head a new purpose, a purpose that would have caused his Back Bay mother to seek an early grave could she have known of it. Nor did Waldo Emerson lose any time in initiating the new regime, which was eventually to fit him for the consummation of his splendid purpose. He thought of it as splendid now, though a few weeks before the vulgar atrocity of it would have nauseated him. Far up in the hills, near the source of the little river, Waldo had found a rocky cave. This he had chosen as his new home. He cleaned it out with scrupulous care, littering the floor with leaves and grasses. Before the entrance he piled a dozen large boulders, so arranged that 3 of them could be removed or replaced either from within or without, thus forming a means of egress and ingress which could be effectually closed against intruders. From the top of a high promontory, a half a mile beyond his cave, Waldo could obtain a view of the ocean, some 8 or 10 miles distant. It was always in his mind that some day a ship would come, and Waldo longed to return to the haunts of civilization. But he did not expect the ship before his plans had properly matured and been put into execution. He argued that he could not sail away from this shore forever without first seeing Nadara, and restoring the confidence in him which he felt his recent desertion had unquestionably shaken to its foundation. As a part of his new regime, Waldo required exercise, and to do this end he set about making a trip to the ocean at least once a week. The way was rough and hazardous, and the first few times Waldo found it almost beyond his strength to make even one leg of the journey between sunrise and dark. This necessitated sleeping out overnight, but this too accorded with the details of the task he had set himself, and so he did it quite cheerfully, and with a sense of martyrdom that he found effectually stilled his most poignant fits of cowardice. As time went on, he was able to cover the whole distance to the ocean and return in a single day. He never coughed now, nor did he glance fearfully from side to side as he strode through the woods and open places of his wild domain. His eyes were bright and clear, his head and shoulders were thrown well back, and the mountain climbing had expanded his chest to a degree that appalled him, the while it gave him much secret satisfaction. It was a very different Waldo from the miserable creature which had been vomited up by the ocean upon the sand of that distant beach. The days that Waldo did not make a trip to the ocean he spent in rambling about the hills in the vicinity of his cave. He knew every rock and tree within 5 miles of his lair. He knew where Nagula hid by day, and the path that he took down to the valley by night. Nor did he any longer tremble at the sight of the great black cat. True, Waldo avoided him, but it was through cool and deliberate caution, which is quite another thing from the senseless panic of fear. Waldo was biding his time. He would not always avoid Nagula. Nagula was a part of Waldo's great plan, but Waldo was not ready for him yet. The young man still bore his cudgel, and in addition he had practiced throwing rocks until he could almost have hit a near-by bird upon the wing. Besides these weapons, Waldo was working upon a spear. It had occurred to him that a spear would be a mighty handy weapon against either man or beast, and so he had set to work to fashion one. He found a very straight young sapling, a little over an inch in diameter and 10 feet long. By means of a piece of edged flint, he succeeded in tapering it to a sharp point. A rawhide thong, plaited from many pieces of small bits of hide taken from the little animals that had fallen before his missiles, served to sling the crude weapon across his shoulders when he walked. With his spear he practiced hour upon hour each day, until he could transfix a fruit the size of an apple 3 times out of 5, at a distance of 50 feet, and at 100 hit a target the size of a man almost without a miss. 6 months had passed since he had fled from an encounter with Flatfoot and Korth. Then Waldo had been a skinny, cowardly weakling. Now his great frame had filled out with healthy flesh, while beneath his skin hard muscles rolled as he bent to one of the many Herculean tasks he had set for himself. For 6 months he had worked with a single purpose in view, but still he felt that the day was not yet come when he might safely venture to put his new-found manhood to the test. Down, far down, in the depth of his soul, he feared that he was yet a coward at heart, and he dared not take the risk. It was too much to expect, he told himself, that a man should be entirely metamorphosed in a brief half-year. He would wait a little longer. It was about this time that Waldo first saw a human being after his last sight of Nadara. It was while he was on his way to the ocean, on one of the trips that had by this time become thrice weekly affairs, that he suddenly came face to face with a skulking, hairy brute. Waldo halted to see what would happen. The man eyed him with those small, cunning, red-rimmed eyes that reminded Waldo of the eyes of a pig. Finally, Waldo spoke in the language of Nadara. "Who are you?" he asked. "Sag the Killer," replied the man. "Who are you?" "Thandar," answered Waldo. "I do not know you," said Sag, "but I can kill you." He lowered his bull head and came for Waldo like a battering ram. The young man dropped the point of his ready spear, bracing his feet. The point entered Sag's breast below the collarbone, stopping only after it had passed entirely through the savage heart. Waldo had not moved. The momentum of the man's body had been sufficient to impale him. As the body rolled over, stiffening after a few convulsive kicks, Waldo withdrew his spear from it, blood smearing its point for a distance of a foot, but Waldo showed no sign of loathing or disgust. Instead, he smiled. It had been so much easier than he had anticipated. Leaving Sag where he had fallen, he continued toward the ocean. An hour later, he heard unusual noises behind him. He stopped to listen. He was being pursued. From the sounds, he estimated that there must be several in the party, and a moment later, as he was crossing a clearing, he got his first view of them as they emerged from the forest he had just quitted. There were at least 20 powerfully muscled brutes. In skin bags thrown across their shoulders, each carried a supply of stones, and these they began to hurl at Waldo as they raced towards him. For a moment the man held his ground, but he quickly realized the futility of putting himself against such odds. Turning, he ran towards the forest, upon the other side of the clearing, while a shower of rocks whizzed about him. Once within the shelter of the trees, there was less likelihood of his being hit by one of the missiles, but occasionally a well-aimed rock would strike him a glancing blow. Waldo hoped that they would tire of the chase before the beach was reached, for he knew that there could be but one outcome of a battle in which one man faced 20. As the pursued and the pursuers raced on through the forest, one of the latter, fleeter than his companions, commenced to close up the gap which had existed between Waldo and the 20. On and on he came, until a backward glance showed Waldo that in another moment this swift foeman would be upon him. He was younger than his fellows and more active, and having thrown all his stones, was free from any burden of weight other than the single garment about his hips. Waldo still clung to his tattered ducks, which from lack of support and more or less rapid disintegration were continually slipping down from his hips, so that they tended to hinder his movements and reduce his speed. Had he been as naked as his pursuer, he would doubtless have distanced him, but he was not, and it was evident that because of this fact he must make a chance in a hand-to-hand encounter that might delay him sufficiently to permit the balance of the horde to reach him. That would be the end of everything. But Waldo Emerson neither screamed in terror nor trembled. When he wheeled to meet the now close savage, there was a smile upon his lips, for Waldo Emerson had killed his man, and there was no longer the haunting fear within his soul that at heart he was a coward. As he turned with couched spear, the caveman came to a sudden stop. This was not what Waldo had anticipated. The other savages were running rapidly toward him, but the fellow who had first overhauled him remained at a safe 20 feet from the point of his weapon. Waldo was being cleverly held until the remainder of the enemy could arrive and overwhelm him. He knew that if he turned to run, the fellow who danced and yelled just beyond his reach would plunge forward and be upon his back in an instant. He tried rushing the man, but the other retreated nimbly, drawing Waldo still closer to those who were coming on. There was no time to be lost. A moment more, and the entire 20 would be upon him. But there were possibilities in a spear that the caveman in his ignorance dreamed not of. There was a lightning-like movement of Waldo's arm, and the aborigine saw the spear darting swiftly through space toward his breast. He tried to dodge, but was too late. Down he went, clutching madly at the slender thing which protruded from his chest. Although one of the dead man's companions was now quite close, Waldo could not relinquish his weapon without an effort. It had cost him considerable time to make, and twice today it had saved his life. Forgetful that he had ever been a coward, he leapt toward the fallen man, reaching his side at the same instant as his foremost pursuer. The two came together like mad bulls, the savage reaching for Waldo's throat, Waldo wielding his light cudgel. For a moment they struggled backward and forward, turning and twisting, the caveman in an effort to close upon Waldo's wind, Waldo to hold the other man at arm's length for the brief instant that would be necessary for one sudden effective blow from the cudgel. The other savages were almost upon them when the young man found his antagonist's throat. Throwing all his weight and strength into the effort, Waldo forced the caveman back until there was room between them for the play of the stick. A single blow was sufficient. As the limp body of his foeman slipped from his grasp, Waldo snatched his precious spear from the heart of its victim, and, with the hands of the infuriated pack almost upon him, turned once more into his flight toward the ocean. The howling band was close upon his heels now, nor could he greatly increase the distance that separated him from them. He wondered what the outcome of the matter was to be. He did not wish to die. His thoughts kept reverting to his boyhood home, to his indulgent mother, to the friends that had been his. He felt that at the last moment he was about to lose his nerve, that, after all, his hard-earned manliness was counterfeit. Then there came to him a vision of an oval olive face framed by a mass of soft black hair, and before it the fear of death dissolved into a grim smile. He did not pause to analyze the reason for it, nor could he have done so then had he tried. He only knew that with those eyes upon him he could not be aught less than courageous. A moment later he burst through the last fringe of the underbrush to emerge upon the clearing that faced the sea. There, by a tiny rivulet, he saw a sight that filled him with thanksgiving, and, farther out upon the ocean, that which he had been waiting and hoping for all these long, hard months, a ship. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A Choice. Seamen upon the beach were filling water casks. There were a dozen of them, and as Waldo plunged from the forest, they looked with startled apprehension at the strange apparition. A great brown giant they saw, clad in a few ragged strings of white duck, for Waldo had kept his apparel as immaculately clean as hard rubbing in cold water would permit. In one hand the strange creature carried a long bloody spear, in the other a light cudgel. Long yellow hair streamed back over his broad shoulders. Several of the men, those who were armed, levelled guns and revolvers at him, but when, as he drew closer, they saw a broad grin upon his face, and heard in perfectly good English, "Don't shoot, I'm a white man," they lowered their weapons and awaited him. He had scarcely reached them when they saw a swarm of naked men dash from the forest in his wake. Waldo saw their eyes directed past him, and knew that his pursuers had come into view. "You'll have to shoot at them, I imagine," he said. "They're not exactly domesticated. Try firing over their heads at first. Maybe you can scare them away without hurting any of them." He disliked the idea of seeing the poor savages slaughtered. It didn't seem just like fair play to mow them down with bullets. The sailors followed his suggestion. At the first reports, the cavemen halted in surprise and consternation. "Let's rush 'em," suggested one of the men, and this was all that was needed to send them scurrying back into the woods. Waldo found that the ship was English, and that all the men spoke his mother tongue in more or less understandable fashion. The second mate, who was in charge of the landing party, proved to have originated in Boston. It was much like being at home again. Waldo was so excited and wanted to ask so many questions all at once that he became almost unintelligible. It seemed scarcely possible that a ship had really come. He realized now that he had never actually entertained any very definite belief that a ship ever would come to this out-of-the-way corner of the world. He had hoped and dreamed, but down in the bottom of his heart he must have felt that years might elapse before he would be rescued. Even now it was difficult to believe that these were really civilized beings like himself. They were on their way to a civilized world. They would soon be surrounded by their families and friends, and he, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, was going with them. In a few months he would see his mother and his father, and all his friends. He would be among his books once more. Even as the last thought flashed through his mind, it was succeeded by mild wonderment that this outlook failed to raise his temperature, as he might have expected that it would. His books had been his real life in the past. Could it be that they had lost something in their glamour? Had his brief experience with the realities of life dulled the edge of his appetite for second-hand hopes, aspirations, deeds, and emotions? It had. Waldo yet craved his books, but they alone would no longer suffice. He wanted something bigger, something more real and tangible. He wanted to read and study, but even more, he wanted to do. And back there in his own world, there would be plenty awaiting the doing. His heart thrilled at the possibilities that lay before the new Waldo Emerson, possibilities of which he never would have dreamed, but for the strange chance which had snatched him bodily from one life to throw him into this new one, which had forced upon him the development of attributes of self-reliance, courage, initiative, and resourcefulness, that would have lain dormant within him always, but for the necessity which had given birth to them. Yes, Waldo realized that he owed a great deal to this experience, a great deal to... And then a sudden realization of the truth rushed in upon him. He owed everything to Nadara. "I was never shipwrecked on a deserted island," said the second mate, breaking in upon Waldo's reveries, "but I can imagine just about how good you feel at the thought that you are at last rescued, and that in an hour or so you will see the shoreline of your prison growing smaller and smaller upon the southern horizon." "Yes," acquiesced Waldo, in a far-away voice, "it's awfully good of you, but I am not going with you." 2 hours later, Waldo Emerson stood alone upon the beach, watching the diminishing hull of a great ship as it dropped over the rim of the world far to the north. A vague hint of tears dimmed his vision. Then he threw back his shoulders, swallowed the thing that had risen into his throat, and with high-held head turned back into the forest. In one hand he carried a razor and a plug of tobacco, the sole mementos of his recent brief contact with the world of civilization. The kindly sailors had urged him to reconsider his decision, but when he remained obdurate, they had insisted that they be permitted to leave some of the comforts of life with him. The only thing that he could think of that he wanted very badly was a razor. Firearms he would not accept, for he had worked out a rather fine chivalry of his own here in this savage world, a chivalry which would not permit him to take any advantage over the primeval inhabitants he had found here other than what his own hands and head might give him. At the last moment one of the seamen, prompted by a generous heart and a keen realization of what life must be without even bare necessities, had thrust upon Waldo the plug of tobacco. As he looked at it now, the young man smiled. That would indeed be the last step, according to mother's ideas, he soliloquized. No lower could I sink. The ship that bore away Waldo's chance of escape carried also a long letter to Waldo's mother. In portions it was rather vague and rambling. It mentioned, among other things, that he had an obligation to fulfill before he could leave his present habitat, but that the moment he was free he should take the first steamer for Boston. The skipper of the ship which had just sailed away had told Waldo that in so far as he knew there might never be another ship touch his island, which was so far out of the beaten course that only the shoreline of it had ever been explored, and scarce a score of vessels had reported it since Captain Cook discovered it in 1773. Yet it was in the face of this that Waldo had refused to leave. As he walked slowly through the wood on his way back toward his cave, he tried to convince himself that he had acted purely from motives of gratitude and fairness, that as a gentleman he could do no less than see Nadara and thank her for the friendly services she had rendered him. But for some reason this seemed a very futile and childish excuse for relinquishing what might easily be his only opportunity to return to civilization. His final decision was that he had acted the part of a fool, yet as he walked he hummed a joyous tune, and his heart was full of happiness and pleasant expectations of what he could not have told. To one thing he had made up his mind, and that was that the next sun would see him on his way to the village of Nadara. His experience with the savages that day had convinced him that he might, with reasonable safety, face Flatfoot and Corth. The more he dwelt upon this idea, the more light-hearted he became. He could not understand it. He should be plunged into the blackest despair, for had he not but just relinquished a chance to return home? And was he not within a day or two to enter the village of the ferocious Flatfoot and the mighty Korth? Even so, his heart sang. Waldo saw nothing of his enemies of the earlier part of the day, as he moved cautiously through the forest, or crossed the little plains and meadows which lay along the route between the ocean and his lair. But his thoughts often reverted to them, and to his adventures of the morning, and the result was that he became aware of a deficiency in his equipment, a deficiency which his recent battle made glaringly apparent. In fact, there were 2 points that might be easily remedied. One was the lack of a shield. Had he had protection of this nature, he would have been in comparatively little danger from the shower of missiles that the savages had flung at him. The other was a sword. With a sword and shield, he could have let his enemies come to very close quarters with perfect impunity to himself, and then have run them through with infinite ease. This new idea would necessitate a delay in his plans. He must finish both shield and sword before he departed for the village of Flatfoot. What with his meditation and his planning, Waldo had made poor time on the return journey from the coast, so that it was after sunset when he entered the last deep ravine beyond the farther summit of which lay his rocky home. In the depths of the ravine it was already quite dark, though a dim twilight still hung upon the surrounding hilltops. He had about completed the arduous ascent of the last steep trail, at the crest of which was his journey's end, when above him, silhouetted against the darkening sky, loomed a great black crouching mass, from the centre of which blazed 2 balls of fire. It was Nagoula, and he occupied the centre of the only trail that led over the edge of the ridge from the ravine below. "I had almost forgotten you, Nagoula," murmured Waldo Emerson. "I could never have gone upon my journey without first interviewing you, but I could have wished a different time and place than this. Let us postpone the matter for a day or so," he concluded aloud, but the only response from Nagoula was an ominous growl. Waldo felt rather uncomfortable. He could not have come upon the great black panther at a more inopportune time or place. It was too dark for Waldo's human eyes, and the cat was above him, and Waldo upon a steep hillside that under the best of conditions offered but a precarious foothold. He tried to shoo the formidable beast away by shouts and menacing gesticulations, but Nagoula would not shoo. Instead, he crept slowly forward, edging his sinuous body inch by inch along the rocky trail until it hung poised above the waiting man a dozen feet below him. 6 months before, Waldo would long since have been shrieking in meteor-like flight down the bend of the ravine behind him. That a wonderful transformation had been wrought within him was evident from the fact that no cry of fright escaped him, and that, far from fleeing, he edged inch by inch upward toward the menacing creature hanging there above him. He carried his spear with the point levelled a trifle below those baleful eyes. He had advanced but a foot or two, however, when with an awful shriek the terrible beast launched itself full upon him. As the heavy body struck him, Waldo went over backward down the cliff, and with him went Nagula. Clawing, tearing, and scratching, the two rolled and bounded down the rocky hillside until near the bottom they came to a sudden stop against a large tree. The growling and screeching ceased, the clawing paws and hands were still. Presently the tropic moon rose over the hilltop to look down upon a little tangled mound of man and beast that lay very quiet against the bole of a great tree near the bottom of a dark ravine. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Thandar, the Seeker. For a long time there was no sign of life in that strange pile of flesh and bone and brawn and glossy black fur and long yellow hair and blood. But toward dawn it moved a little, down near the bottom of the heap, and a little later there was a groan, and then all was still again for many minutes. Presently it moved again, this time more energetically, and after several efforts a yellow head streaked and matted with blood emerged from beneath. It required the better part of an hour for the stunned and lacerated Waldo to extricate himself from the entangling embrace of Nagula. When finally he staggered to his feet, he saw that the great cat lay dead before him, the broken shaft of the spear protruding from the sleek black breast. It was quite evident that the beast had lived but the barest fraction of an instant after it had launched itself upon the man. But during that brief interval of time it had wrought sore havoc with its mighty talons, though fortunately for Waldo the great jaws had not found him. From breast to knees ghastly wounds were furrowed in the man's brown skin where the powerful hind feet of the beast had raked him. That he owed his life to the chance that had brought about the encounter upon a steep hillside rather than on the level seemed quite apparent, for during their tumble down the declivity Nagula had been unable to score with any degree of accuracy. As Waldo looked down upon himself, he was at first horrified by the frightful appearance of his wounds, but when a closer examination showed them to be superficial, he realized that the only danger lay in infection. Every bone and muscle in his body ached from the manhandling and the fall, and the wounds themselves were painful, almost excruciatingly so, when a movement of his body stretched or tore them. But notwithstanding his suffering, he found himself smiling as he contemplated the remnants of his long-suffering ducks. There remained of their once stylish glory not a shred. The panther's sharp claws had finished what time and brambles had so well commenced, and of their linen partner, the white outing shirt, only the neckband remained, with a single fragment as large as one's hand depending behind. Nature is a wonderful leveller, thought Waldo. It is evident that she hates artificiality as she does a vacuum. I shall really need you now, he concluded, looking at the beautiful black coat of Nagula. Despite his suffering, Waldo crawled to his lair, where he selected a couple of sharp-edged stones from his collection and returned to the side of Nagula. Leaving his tools there, he went on down to the bottom of the ravine, where in a little crystal stream he bathed his wounds. Then he returned once more to his kill. After half a day of the most arduous labour, Waldo succeeded in removing the panther's hide, which he dragged laboriously to his lair, where he fell exhausted, unable even to crawl within. The next day Waldo worked upon the inner surface of the hide, removing every particle of flesh by scraping it with a sharp stone, so that there might be no danger of decomposition. He was still very weak and sore, but he could not bear the thought of losing the pelt that had cost him so much to obtain. When the last vestige of flesh had been scraped away, he crawled into his lair, where he remained for a week, only emerging for food and water. At the end of that time his wounds were almost healed, and he had entirely recovered from his lameness and the shock of the adventure, so that it was with real pleasure and exultation that he gloated over his beautiful trophy. Always, as he thought of the time that he should have it made ready for girding about his loins, he saw himself, not through his own eyes, but as he imagined that another would see him, and that other was Nadara. For many days Waldo scraped and pounded the great skin, as he had seen the cavemen scrape and pound in the brief instant he had watched them with Nadara from the edge of the forest before the village of Flatfoot. At last he was rewarded with a pelt sufficiently pliable for the purpose of the rude apparel he contemplated. A strip an inch wide he trimmed off to form a supporting belt. With this he tied the black skin around his waist, passed one arm through a hole he had made for that purpose near the upper edge, bringing the forepaws forward about his chest. He crossed and fastened them to secure the garment from falling from the upper part of his body. It was a very proud Waldo that strutted forth in the finery of his new apparel. But the pride was in the prowess. Theft had won the thing for him. Vulgar, gross, brutal physical prowess, the very attribute upon which he had looked with supercilious contempt 6 months before. Next, Waldo turned his attention toward the fashioning of a sword, a new spear, and a shield. The first two were comparatively easy of accomplishment. He had them both completed in half a day, and from a 2-inch strip of panther hide he made also a sword belt to pass over his right shoulder and support his sword at his left side. But the shield almost defied his small skill and newborn ingenuity. With small twigs and grasses he succeeded, after nearly a week of painstaking endeavour, in weaving a rude oval buckler some 3 feet long by 2 wide, which he covered with the skins of several small animals that had fallen before his death-dealing stones. A strip of hide fastened upon the back of the shield held it to his left arm. With it Waldo felt more secure against the swiftly thrown missiles of the savages he knew he should encounter on his forthcoming expedition. At last came the morning for departure. Rising with the sun, Waldo took his morning tub in the cold spring that rose a few yards from his cave. Then he got out the razor that the sailor had given him, and after scraping off his scanty yellow beard, hacked his tawny hair until it no longer fell about his shoulders and in his eyes. Then he gathered up his weapons, rolled the boulders before the entrance to his cave, and turning his back upon his rough home, set off down the little stream toward the distant valley where it wound through the forest along the face of the cliffs to Flatfoot and Corth. As he stepped lightly along the hazardous trail, leaping from ledge to ledge in the descent of the many sheer drops over which the stream fell, he might have been a reincarnation of some primeval hunter from whose savage loins had sprung the warriors and the strong men of a world. The tall, well-muscled, brown body, the clear, bright eyes, the high-held head, the sword, the spear, the shield were all a far cry from the weak and futile thing that had lain grovelling in the sand upon the beach, sweating and shrieking in terror 6 short months before. And yet it was the same. What one good but mistaken woman had smothered, another had brought out, and the result of the influence of both was a much finer specimen of manhood than either might have evolved alone. In the afternoon of the 3rd day, Waldo came to the forest opposite the cliffs where lay the home of Nadara. Cautiously he stole from tree to tree until he could look out unseen upon the honeycombed face of the lofty escarpment. All was lifeless and deserted. The cave mouths looked out upon the valley, sad and lonely. There was no sign of life in any direction as far as Waldo could see. Coming from the forest, he crossed the clearing and approached the cliffs. His eye, now become alert in woodcraft, detected the young grass growing in what had once been well-beaten trails. He needed no further evidence to assure him that the caves were deserted, and had been for some time. One by one he entered and explored several of the cliff dwellings. All gave the same mute corroboration of what was everywhere apparent. The village had been evacuated without haste in an orderly manner. Everything of value had been removed, only a few broken utensils remaining as indication that it had ever constituted human habitation. Waldo was utterly confounded. He had not the remotest idea in which direction to search. During the balance of the afternoon he wandered along the various ledges, entering first one cave and then another. He wondered which had been Nadara's. He tried to imagine her life among these crude, primitive surroundings, among the beast-like men and women who were her people. She did not seem to harmonize with either. He was convinced that she was more out of place here than Flatfoot would have been in a Back Bay drawing-room. The more his mind dwelt upon her, the sadder he became. He tried to convince himself that it was purely disappointment in being thwarted in his desire to thank her for her kindness to him, and demonstrate that her confidence in his prowess had not been misplaced. But always he discovered that his thoughts returned to Nadara rather than to the ostensible object of his adventure. In short, he began to realize, rather vaguely it is true, that he had come because he wanted to see the girl again, but why he wanted to see her he did not know. That night he slept in one of the deserted caves, and the next morning set forth upon his quest for Nadara. For 3 days he searched the little valley, but without results. There was no sign of any other village within it. Then he passed over into another valley to the north. For weeks he wandered hither and thither, without being rewarded by even a sight of a human being. Early one afternoon, as he was chopping a barrier in search of other valleys, he came suddenly face to face with a great hairy man. Both stopped, the hairy one glaring with his nasty little eyes. "I can kill you," growled the savage. Waldo had no desire to fight. It was information he was searching, but he almost smiled at the ready greeting of the man. It was the same that Sag the Killer had accorded him that day he had gone down to the sea for the last time. It came as readily and as glibly from these primitive men as good morning falls from the lips of the civilized races. Among the latter he realized that it had its counterpart in the stony stares which Anglo-Saxon strangers vouchsafe one another. "I have no quarrel with you," replied Waldo. "Let us be friends." "You are afraid," taunted the hairy one. Waldo pointed to his sable garment. "Ask Nagula," he said. The man looked at the trophy. There could be no mightier argument for a man's valour than that. He came a step closer, that he might scrutinize it more carefully. Fully grown and in perfect health, he grunted to himself. This is no worn and mangy hide peeled from the rotting carcass of one dead of sickness. "How did you slay Nagula?" he asked suddenly. Waldo indicated his spear. Then he drew his garment aside and pointed to the vivid, new-healed scars that striped his body. "We met at dusk at a cliff top. He was above, I below. When we reached the bottom of the ravine, Nagula was dead. But it was nothing for Thandar. I am Thandar." Waldo rightly suspected that a little bravado would make a good impression on the intellect primeval, nor was he mistaken. "What do you here in my country?" asked the man, but his tone was less truculent than before. "I am searching for Flatfoot and Korth and Nadara," said Waldo. The other's eyes narrowed. "What would you of them?" he asked. "Nadara was good to me. I would repay her. But Flatfoot and Korth, what of them?" insisted the man. "My business is with them. When I see them, I shall transact it," Waldo parried, for he had seen the cunning look in the man's eyes, and he did not like it. "Can you lead me to them?" "I can tell you where they are, but I am not bound thither," replied the man. 3 days toward the setting sun will bring you to the village of Flatfoot. There you will find Korth also, and Nadara." And without further parley, the savage turned and trotted toward the east. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Nadara again. Waldo watched him out of sight, half-minded to follow, for he was far from satisfied that the fellow had been entirely honest with him. Why he should have been otherwise, Waldo could not imagine. But nevertheless, there had been an indefinable suggestion of duplicity in the man's behaviour that had puzzled him. However, Waldo took up his search toward the west, passing down from the hills into a deep valley, the bottom of which was overgrown by a thick tangle of tropical jungle. He had forced his way through this for nearly half a mile when he came to the bank of a wide, slow-moving river. Its water was thick with sediment, not clean, sparkling, and inviting, as were the little mountain streams of the hills and valleys farther south. Waldo travelled along the edge of the river in a northwesterly direction, searching for a fjord. The steep, muddy banks offered no foothold. It was the fine and dainty outline of a perfect foot, with the arch well defined. It was new, as were many of the others, and like the other newer ones, it led down to the river and then back again, as though she who made it had come from water and then returned from whence she had come. Waldo knew that the tracks leading away from the river were the newer, because where the two trails overlapped, those coming up from the ford were always over those which led downward. The multiplicity of signs indicated a considerable community, and their newness the proximity of the makers. Waldo hesitated but a moment before he reached a decision, and then he turned up the trail away from the river, and at a rapid trot followed the spoor along its winding course through the jungle to where it emerged at the base of the foothills, to wind upward toward their crest. He found that the trail he was following crossed the hills but a few yards from the spot at which he had met the caveman a short time before. Evidently the man had been returning from the river when he had espied Waldo. The young man could see where the fellow's tracks had left the main trail, and he followed them to the point where the man had stood during his conversation with Waldo. From there they led toward the east for a short distance, and then turned suddenly north to re-enter the main trail. Waldo could see that as soon as the man had reached a point from which he would be safe from the stranger's observation, he had broken into a rapid trot, and as he already had 2 hours' start, Waldo felt that he would have to hurry were he to overtake him. Just why he wished to do so he did not consider, but intuitively, possibly, he felt that the surly brute could give him much more and accurate information than he had, nor could Waldo eliminate the memory of those dainty feminine footprints. It was foolish, of course, and he fully realized the fact, but his silly mind would insist upon attributing them to the cave girl, Nadara. For 2 hours he trotted doggedly along the trail, which for the most part was well defined. There were places, of course, which taxed his trailing ability, but by circling widely from these points he always was able to pick up the tracks again. He had come down from the hills and entered an open forest where the trail was entirely lost in the mossy carpet that lay beneath the trees, when he was startled by a scream, a woman's scream, and the hoarse gutturals of 2 men, deep and angry. Hastening toward the sound, Waldo came upon the authors of the commotion in a little glade half hidden by surrounding bushes. There were 3 actors in the hideous tragedy: a hairy brute dragging a protesting girl by her long black hair, and an old man who followed, protesting futilely against the outrage that threatened the young woman. None of them saw Waldo as he ran toward them until he was almost upon them, and then the beast who grasped the girl looked up, and Waldo recognized him as the same who had sent him toward the west earlier in the day. At the same instant he saw the girl was Nadara. In the brief interval that the recognition required, there sloughed from the heart and mind and soul of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones every particle of the civilization and culture and refinement that had required countless ages in the building, stripping him naked, age on age, down to the primordial beast that had begot his first human progenitor. He saw red through blood as he leapt for the throat of the man-beast, whose ruthless hands were upon Nadara. His lip curled in the fighting snarl that exposed his long unused canine fangs. He forgot sword and shield and spear. He was no longer a man, but a terrible beast, and the hairy brute that witnessed the metamorphosis blanched and shrank back in fear. But he could not escape the fury of that mad charge or the raging creature that sought his throat. For a moment they struggled in a surging, swaying embrace, and then toppled to the ground, the hairy one beneath. Rolling, tearing, and biting they battled, each seeking a death hold upon the other. Time and again the gleaming teeth of the once fastidious Bostonian sank into the breast and shoulder of his antagonist, but it was the jugular his primal instinct sought. The girl and the old man had drawn away where they could watch the battle in safety. Nadara's eyes were wide in fascination. Her slim brown hands were tight pressed against her rapidly rising and falling breasts as she leaned a little forward with parted lips, drinking in every detail of the conflict between the 2 beasts. Ah, but was the yellow-haired giant really fighting for possession of her, or merely in protection because she was a woman? Could readily conceive from her knowledge of him that he might be acting now solely from some peculiar sense of duty which she realized that he might entertain, although she could not herself understand it. Yes, that was it, and when he had conquered his rival, he would run away again, as he had months before. At the thought, Nadara felt herself flush with mortification. No, he should never have another opportunity to repeat that terrible affront. As she allowed her mind to dwell on the humiliating moment that had witnessed the discovery that Thandar had fled from her at the very threshold of her home, Nadara found herself hating him again as fiercely as she had all these long months, a hatred that had almost dissolved at the sight of him as he rushed out of the underbrush a moment before to wrest her from the clutches of her hideous tormentor. Waldo and his antagonist were still tearing futilely at one another in mad efforts to maim or kill. The giant muscles of the caveman gave him but little if any advantage over his agile though slightly less powerful adversary. The hairy one used his teeth to better advantage, with the result that Waldo was badly torn and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Both were weakening now, and it seemed to the girl who watched that the younger man would be the first to succumb to the terrific strain under which both had been. She took a step forward and, stooping, picked up a stone. Her small strength would be ample to turn the scales as she might choose. A sharp blow upon the head of either would give his adversary a trifling advantage that would spell death for the other one. She struck. The two men had struggled to their feet again as she approached with raised weapon. At the very moment that it left her hand, they swung completely round, so that Waldo faced her, and in the instant before the missile struck his forehead, he saw Nadara in the very act of throwing, upon her face, an expression of hatred and loathing. Then he lost consciousness and went down, dragging with him the caveman, upon whose throat his fingers had just found their hold. End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 9 The Seeker. When the old man saw what had happened, he ran forward and grasped Nadara by the wrist. "Quick!" he cried. "Quick, my daughter! You have killed him who would have saved you, and now nothing but flight may keep Korth from having his way with you." As in a trance, the girl turned and departed with him. They had scarcely disappeared within the underbrush when Waldo returned to consciousness, so slight had been the effect of the blow upon his head. To his surprise, he found the caveman lying very still beside him, but an instant later he read the reason for it in the little projecting ridge of rock upon which lay his foe's forehead. In falling, the savage man had struck thus and lost consciousness. Almost immediately the hairy one opened his eyes, but before he could gather his scattered senses, sinewy fingers found his throat, and he lapsed once more into oblivion, from which there was no awakening. As Waldo staggered to his feet, he saw that the girl had vanished, and there swept back into his mind the memory of the hate that had been in her face as she struck him down. It seemed incredible that she should have turned against him so, and at the very moment, too, when he had risked his life in her service. But that she had there could be no doubt, for he had seen her cast the stone. With his own eyes he had seen her, and, too, he had seen the hatred and loathing in her face as she looked straight into his. But what he had not seen was the look of horror that followed as the missile struck him instead of Korth, sending him crumpling to earth. Slowly Waldo turned away from the scene of battle, and without even a second look at his vanquished enemy, limped painfully into the brush. His heart was very heavy, and he was weak from exhaustion and loss of blood, but he staggered on, back toward his mountain lair, as he thought, until, unable to go further, he sank down upon a little grassy knoll and slept. When Nadara recovered from the shock of the thing she had done sufficiently to reason for herself, she realized that after all Thandar might not be dead, and though the old man protested long and loudly against it, she insisted upon retracing her steps toward the spot where they had left the yellow giant in the clutches of Korth. Very cautiously, the girl threaded her way through the maze of shrubbery and creepers that filled the intervening space between the forest trees, until she came silently to the edge of the clearing in which the two had fought. As she peered anxiously through the last curtain of foliage, she saw a single body lying quiet and still upon the sward, and an instant later recognized it as Korth's. For several minutes she watched it before she became convinced that the man who had so terrorized her whole childish life could never again offer her harm. She looked about for Thandar, but he was nowhere to be seen. Nadara could scarcely believe that her eyes were not deceiving her. It was incredible that the Yellow One could have gone down to unconsciousness before her unintentional blow, and yet have mastered the mighty Korth. But how else could Korth have met his death and Thandar be gone? She approached quite close to the dead man, turning the body over with her foot until the throat was visible. There she saw the finger marks that had done the work, and with a little thrill of pride she turned back into the forest, calling Thandar's name aloud. But Thandar did not hear. Half a mile away he lay weak and unconscious from loss of blood. Morning found Nadara sleeping in a sturdy tree upon the trail along which Waldo had followed Korth. She had discovered the footprints of the two men the evening before, while she had been searching unsuccessfully for the trail which Waldo had followed after the battle. She hoped now that the spoor might lead her to Thandar's cave, to which she felt it quite possible he might have returned by another way. When the girl awoke, she again took up her journey, following the tracks as unerringly as a hound up through the hilly country, across the divide and down into the jungle to the very watering place at which her tribe had drank a few days earlier. Here she made a brief stay. Then on again down the river, back through the jungle and onto the divide once more. She was much mystified by the windings of the trail, but for days she followed the fading spoor until, becoming fainter and fainter as it grew older, she lost it entirely at last. She was quite sure by now, however, that it led from her tribe's former territory, and so she kept on, hoping against hope that soon she would come across the fresh track of Thandar where he had passed her on his return journey to his home. Nadara had eluded the old man when she started upon her search for Thandar. So it was that the old fellow returned to the dwellings of his people alone the following day. Flatfoot was the first to greet him. "Where is the girl?" he growled. "And where is Korth? Has he taken her? Answer me the truth, or I will break every bone in your carcass." "I do not know where the girl is," answered the old man truthfully enough. "But Korth lies dead in the little glade beyond the 3 great trees. A mighty man killed him as he was dragging Nadara off into the thicket." "And the man has taken the girl for himself?" yelled Flatfoot. "You old thief, you! This is some of your work. Always have you tried to cheat me of this girl since you first knew that I desired her. Whither went they? Quick, before I kill you!" "I do not know," replied the old man. "For hours I searched, until darkness came, but neither of them could I find, and my old eyes are no longer keen for trailing, so I was forced to abandon my hunt and return here when morning came." "By the 3 trees the trail starts, you say?" cried Flatfoot. "That is enough. I shall find them. And when I return with the girl, it will be time enough to kill you. Now it would delay me too much." And with that the caveman hurried away into the forest. It took him half a day to find Nadara's trail, but at last his search was rewarded, and as she had made no effort to hide it, he moved rapidly along in the wake of the unsuspecting girl. But he was not as swift as she, and the chase bid fair to be a long one. When Waldo woke, he found the sun beating down upon his face, and though he was lame and sore, he felt quite strong enough to continue his journey. But whither he should go he did not know. Now that Nadara had turned against him, the island held nothing for him, and he was on the point of starting back toward his far-distant lair, from where he might visit the ocean often to watch for a passing ship, when the sudden decision came to him to see the girl again, regardless of her evident hostility, and learn from her own lips the exact reason of her hatred for him. He had had no idea that the loss of her friendship would prove such a blow to him, so that his pride suffered as well as his heart as he contemplated his harrowed emotions. Of course, he was reasonably sure that Nadara's attitude was due to his ungallant desertion, for which act he had long suffered the most acute pangs of remorse and contrition. Yet he felt that her apparent vindictiveness was not warranted by even the grave offense against chivalry and gratitude of which he had been guilty. It presently occurred to him that by the traitorous attack which he believed that she had made upon him while he was acting in her defense, she had forfeited every claim which her former kindness might have given her upon him. But with this realization came another, a humiliating thought: he still wished to see her. He, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, had become so devoid of pride that he would voluntarily search out one who had wronged and outraged his friendship, with the avowed determination of seeking a reconciliation. It was unthinkable, and yet, as he admitted the impossibility of it, he set forth in search of her. Waldo wondered not a little at the strange emotion, inherent gregarious instinct he thought it, which drew him toward Nadara. It did not occur to him that during all the past solitary months he had scarcely missed the old companionship of his Back Bay friends, that for once that they had been the subject of his reveries, the cave-girl had held the center of that mental stage 1,000 times. He failed to realize that it was not the companionship of the many that he craved, that it was not the community instinct, or that his strange longing could be satisfied by but a single individual. No, Waldo Emerson did not know what was the matter with him, nor was it likely that he ever would find out before it was too late. The young man attempted to retrace his steps to the battleground of the previous day, but he had been so dazed after the encounter that he had no clear recollection of the direction he had taken after he quitted the glade. So it was that he stumbled in precisely the opposite direction, presently emerging from the underbrush almost at the foot of a low cliff tunneled with many caves. All about were the morose, unhappy community whose savage lives were spent in almost continual wandering from one filthy, comfortless warren to another equally foul and wretched. At sight of them, Waldo did not flee in dismay, as most certainly would have been the case a few months earlier. Instead, he walked confidently toward them. As he approached, they ceased whatever work they were engaged upon and eyed him suspiciously. Then several burly males approached him warily. At 100 yards they halted. "What do you want?" they cried. "If you come to our village, we can kill you." Before Waldo could reply, an old man crawled from a cave near the base of the cliff, and as his eyes fell upon the stranger, he hurried as rapidly as his ancient limbs would carry him to the little knot of ruffians who composed the reception committee. He spoke to them for a moment in a low tone, and, as he was talking, Waldo recognized him as the old man who had accompanied Nadara on the previous day at the battle in the glade. When he had finished speaking, one of the cavemen assented to whatever proposal the decrepit one had made, and Waldo saw that each of the others nodded his head in approval. Then the old man advanced slowly toward Waldo. When he had come quite close, he spoke. "I am an old man," he said. "Thandar would not kill an old man." "Of course not. But how know you that my name is Thandar?" replied Waldo. "Nadara, she who is my daughter, has spoken of you often. Yesterday we saw you as you battled with that son of Nagula. Nadara told me then that it was you. What would Thandar among the people of Flatfoot?" "I come as a friend," replied Waldo, "among the friends of Nadara. For Flatfoot I care nothing. He is no friend of Nadara, whose friends are Thandar's friends, and whose enemies are Thandar's enemies. Where is Nadara? But first, where is Flatfoot? I have come to kill him." The words and the savage challenge slipped as easily from the cultured tongue of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones as though he had been born and reared in the most rocky and barren cave of this savage island, nor did they sound strange or unusual to him. It seemed that he had said the most natural and proper thing under the circumstances that there was to say. "Flatfoot is not here," said the old man, "nor is Nadara. She—" But here Waldo interrupted him. "Korth, then," he demanded. "Where is Korth? I can kill him first, and Flatfoot when he returns." The old man looked at the speaker in unfeigned surprise. "Korth!" he exclaimed. "Korth is dead. Can it be that you do not know that he whom you killed yesterday was Korth?" Waldo's eyes opened as wide in surprise as had the old man's. Korth! He had killed the redoubtable Korth with his bare hands. Korth, who could crush the skull of a full-grown man with a single blow from his open palm. Clearly he recollected the very words in which Nadara had described this horrible brute, that time she had harrowed his poor, coward nerves as they approached the village of Flatfoot. And now he, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, had met and killed the creature from whom he had so fearfully fled a few months ago. And, wonder of wonders, he had not even thought to use the weapons upon which he had spent so many hours of handicraft and months of practice in preparation for just this occasion. Of a sudden he recalled the old man's statement that Nadara was not there. "Where is she? Nadara!" he cried, turning so suddenly upon the Ancient One that the old fellow drew back in alarm. "I have done nothing to harm her," he cried. "I followed, and would have brought her back, but I am old and could not find her. Once, when I was young, there was no better trailer or mighty warrior among my people than I. But—" "Yes, yes," exclaimed Waldo impatiently. "But Nadara, where is she?" "I do not know," replied the old man. "She has gone, and I could not find her. Well do I remember how, years ago, when the trail of an enemy was faint or the signs of game hard to find, men would come to ask me to help them. But now—" "Of course," interrupted Waldo. "But Nadara, do you not even know in what direction she has gone?" "No, but since Flatfoot has set forth upon her trail, it should be easy to track the two of them." "Flatfoot set out after Nadara?" cried Waldo. "Why?" "For many moons he has craved her for his mate, as has Korth," explained Nadara's father. "But I think that each feared the other, and because of that fact Nadara was saved from both. But at last Korth came upon us alone and away from the village, and then he grasped Nadara and would have taken her away, for Flatfoot was not about to prevent. You came then, and the rest you know. If I had been younger, neither Flatfoot nor Korth would have dared menace Nadara, for when I was a young man I was very terrible, and the record of my kills was a—" "How long since did Flatfoot set out after Nadara?" Waldo broke in. "But a few hours since," replied the old man. "It would be an easy thing for me to overtake him by night had I the speed of my youth, for I well remember—" "From where did Flatfoot start upon the trail?" cried the young man. "Lead me to the place." "This way, then, Thandar," said the other, starting off toward the forest. "I will show you if you will save Nadara from Flatfoot. I love her. She has been very kind and good to me. She is unlike the rest of our people. I should die happy if I knew that you have saved her from Flatfoot, but I am an old man and may not live until Nadara returns. Ah, that reminds me. There is that in my cave which belongs to Nadara, and were I to die, there would be none to protect it for her. Will you wait for the moment that it will take me to run and fetch it, that you may carry it to her? For I am sure that you will find her, though I am not as sure that you will overcome Flatfoot if you meet him. He is a very terrible man." Waldo hated to waste a minute of the precious time that was allowing Flatfoot to win nearer and nearer Nadara. But if it were in a service for the girl who had been so kind to him, and for the happiness of her old father, he could not refuse, so he waited impatiently while the old fellow tottered off toward the caves. Those who had come halfway to meet Waldo had hovered at a safe distance while he was speaking to Nadara's father, and when the two turned toward the forest, all had returned to their work in evident relief, for the old man had told them that the stranger was the mighty warrior who had killed the terrible Korth with his bare hands, nor had the story lost anything in the telling. After what seemed hours to the waiting Waldo, the old man returned with a little package carefully wrapped in the skin of a small rodent, the seams laboriously sewed in a manner of lacing with pieces of gut. "This is Nadara's," he said as they continued their way toward the forest. "It contains many strange things of which I know not the meaning or purpose. They all were taken from the body of her mother when the woman died. Will you give them to her?" "Yes," said Waldo, "I will give them to Nadara, or die in the trying of it." End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 10 The Trail's End. Soon they came upon the trail of Flatfoot in the glade by the three great trees. They had not searched for it sooner, for the old man knew that it would start from that point upon its quest for the girl. The tracks circled the glade a dozen times in widening laps, until at last, at the point where Flatfoot must have picked up the spoor of Nadara, they broke suddenly away into the underbrush. Once the way was plain, Waldo bid the old man be of good heart, for he would surely bring his daughter back to him unharmed if the thing lay in the power of man. Then he hurried off upon the new-made trail that lay as plain and readable before him as had the printed page of his former life. But never had he bent with such keen interest to the reading of his favorite author as he did to this absorbing drama written in the turned leaves, the scattered twigs, and the soft mud of a primeval forest, by the feet of a savage man and a savage maid. Toward mid-afternoon, Waldo became aware that he was much weaker from the effects of his battle with Korth than he had supposed. He had lost much blood from his wounds, and the exertion of following the trail at a swift pace had reopened some of the worst ones, so that now, as he ran, he was leaving a little trail of blood behind him. The discovery made him almost frantic, for it seemed to presage failure. His condition would handicap him in the race after the two, along whose track he pursued, so that it would be a miracle were he to reach Flatfoot before the brute overtook Nadara. And if he did overtake him in time, what then? Would he be physically able to cope with the brawny monster? He feared that he would not, but that he kept doggedly to the grueling chase augured well for the new manhood that had been so recently born within him. On and on he stumbled, until at dusk he slipped and fell exhausted to the earth. Twice he struggled to his feet in an attempt to go on, but he was forced to give in, lying where he was until morning. Slightly refreshed, he ate of the roots and fruit which abounded in the forest, taking up the chase again, but this time more slowly. He was now convinced that the way led back along the same trail which he had followed into the country, and when he reached the point at which he had first met Korth on the previous day, he cut across the little space which intervened between the caveman's tracks and the point at which he had stood, before he went down over the divide into the jungle toward the river and the ford. A moment later he was rewarded by the sight of Nadara's dainty footprints, as well as those of Flatfoot leading away along his old trail. The act had saved him several miles of needless tracking. All that day he followed as rapidly as his weakened condition would permit, but his best efforts seemed dismally snail-like. Along the way he bowled over a couple of large rodents, which he ate raw, for he had long since learned the desirability of a meat diet for one undergoing severe physical exertion, and he conquered his natural aversion for the uncooked flesh. He even had come to relish it, though often as he dined thus upon meat a broad grin illumined his countenance at the thought of the horror with which his mother and his Boston friends would view such a hideous performance. As he continued trailing the two, he was at first surprised to discover the fidelity with which Nadara had clung to his old trail, and because of this fact he was often able to save miles at a time by taking crosscuts, where on his way in he had made wide detours. But at last, on the third day, when he attempted this at a place which would have saved him fully 10 miles, he was dismayed by the discovery that he could not again pick up either Nadara's trail or that of the caveman. Even his own old trail was entirely obliterated. It was this fact which caused him the greatest concern, for it meant that if Nadara really had been following it, she must now be wandering rather aimlessly, possibly in an attempt to again locate it, in which event her speed would be materially reduced, and the probability of her capture by Flatfoot much enhanced. It was possible, too, that the beast already had overtaken her. This, in fact, might be the true cause of the cessation of the pursuit along the way which it had proceeded up to this point. The thought sent Waldo back along his former route, which he was able to follow by recollection, though the spoor was seldom visible. He came upon no sign of those he sought that day, but the next morning he found the point at which Nadara had lost his old trail upon a rocky ridge. The girl evidently assumed that it would lead into the valley below, where she might pick it up again in the soft earth, and so her footprints led down a shelving bluff, while plain above them showed the huge imprints of Flatfoot. Up to this point, at least, he had not caught up with her. Waldo breathed a sigh of relief at the discovery. The trail was at least 2 days old, for Nadara and Flatfoot had traveled much more rapidly than the wounded man who haunted their footsteps like a grim shadow. About noon, Waldo came to a little stream at which both of those who preceded him had evidently stopped to drink. He could see where they had knelt in the soft grass at the water's edge. As Waldo stopped to quench his own thirst, his eyes rested for an instant upon the farther bank, which at that point was little more than 10 feet from him. He saw that the opposite shore was less grassy, and that it sloped down to the water, forming a muddy beach partially submerged. But what riveted his attention were several deep imprints in the mud. He could not be certain, of course, at that distance, but he was sure enough that he had recognized them to cause him to leap to his feet, forgetful of his thirst, and plunge through the stream for a closer inspection. As he bent to examine the spoor at close range, he could scarcely repress a cry of exultation. They had been made by the hands and knees of Nadara, as she had stooped to drink at the very spot not 24 hours before. She must have circled back toward the brook for some reason, but by far the greatest cause for rejoicing was the fact that Nadara's trail alone was there. Flatfoot had not yet come upon her, and Waldo now was between them. The knowledge that he might yet be in time, and that he was gaining sufficiently in strength to make it reasonably certain that he could overhaul the girl eventually, filled Waldo with renewed vigor. He hastened along Nadara's trail now with something of the energy that had been his directly before his battle with Korth. His wounds had ceased bleeding, and for several days he had eaten well, and by night slept soundly, for he had reasoned that only by conserving his energy and fortifying himself in every way possible could he succor the girl. That night he slept in a little thicket which had evidently harbored Nadara the night before. The following day the way lay across a rolling country, cut by numerous deep ravines and lofty divides. That the pace was telling on the girl Waldo could read in the tell-tale spoor that revealed her lagging footsteps. Upon each eminence the man halted to strain his eyes ahead for a sight of her. About noon he discerned far ahead a shimmering line which he knew must be the sea. Surely his long pursuit must end there. As he was about to plunge on again along Nadara's trail, something drew his eyes toward the rear, and there, upon another hilltop a mile or two behind, he saw the stocky figure of a half-naked man. It was Flatfoot. The caveman must have seen Waldo at the same instant, for with a menacing wave of his huge fist he increased his gait to a run, an instant later disappearing into the ravine which lay at the bottom of the hill upon which he had come into view. Waldo was undecided whether to wait for the encounter where he was, or hasten on in an effort to overtake Nadara, that she might not escape him entirely. He knew that he stood a good chance of being killed in the conflict, and he also knew that, were he victorious, it might easily be at such a terrible price that he would be physically incapable of continuing his search for the girl for many days. As he meditated, his eyes wandered back and forth across the landscape before him, searching for Nadara. To his right lay, at a little distance, a level plain which stretched to the foot of low-lying cliffs at the valley's southern rim, some 3 or 4 miles distant. In this direction his view was almost unobstructed, but it was not in the direction of the girl's flight, so that it was but by accident that Waldo's eyes swept casually across the peaceful scene which would at another time have chained his attention with its quiet and alluring beauty. It was as he swept a backward glance in the direction of Flatfoot that his eye was arrested by the hint of something far out across the valley, a little behind his own position. To the Waldo of a few months previous, it would not have been visible, but the new woodcraft of the man scented the abnormal in the vague suggestion of movement out among the long waving grasses of the plain. And now, with every sense alert and riveted upon that spot, he was quick to perceive that it was an animal moving slowly toward the cliffs at the upper end of the valley. Presently a little rise of ground, less thickly grassed, brought the creature into full view for an instant. But in that instant Waldo saw that the thing he watched was a woman. As he turned to hurry after her, he saw Flatfoot top another hill a half-mile nearer than he had been before, and as the caveman came into view he turned his eyes in the direction that Waldo had been looking. A second later, and he had abandoned the pursuit of Waldo, and was running rapidly toward the woman. Nadara had apparently circled back once more, this time from the sea, and coming up the valley had passed Waldo and come opposite Flatfoot before either of them had discovered her. The young man gave a little cry of alarm as he realized that the caveman was nearer to the girl than he, by a good half-mile he judged, and so he put every ounce of his speed into the wild dash he made down the hill into a gully which led out upon the valley. On and on he raced, unable to see either Flatfoot or Nadara, hoping, ever hoping, that he would be first to win to her side. For Nadara had told him of the atrocities that such a creature as Flatfoot might perpetrate upon a woman rather than permit her to escape him or fall into the hands of another. Nadara, being upwind, caught neither the scent nor noise of the two who were racing madly toward her. The first knowledge she had that she was not alone in the valley was the sight of Flatfoot as he broke suddenly through a clump of tall grass not 50 paces from her. She gave a little scream and started to run, but she was very tired from the days of unremitting flight which had so sorely taxed her endurance, and thus it was no wonder that she slipped and fell before she had taken a dozen steps. Scarcely had she gained her feet when Flatfoot was upon her, one hand grasping her by the arm. "Come with me in peace, or I will kill you," he cried. "Kill me then," retorted the despairing girl, "for I shall never come with you. First will I kill myself." Flatfoot did not wish to kill her, nor did he wish her to escape, as she would be very likely to do should he be interrupted by the fellow who must even now be quite close to them. Possibly, if he could keep the girl quiet, they might hide in the grass until their pursuer had gone by. And so Flatfoot, acting upon the idea, clapped a rough hand over Nadara's mouth and dragged her back along the trail he had just made. The girl struggled, striking and clawing at the hairy brute that pulled her along at his side. But she was as helpless in his clutches as if she had been a day-old babe. She did not know that help was so close at hand, or she would have found the means to free her mouth and cry out once at least. As it was, she wondered that Flatfoot should attempt to silence her in this way if there were none to hear her screams. For days she had known that the caveman was on her trail. For once in doubling back upon herself, she had passed but a short distance from a ridge she had traversed the preceding day, and had seen the man's squat figure and recognized his awkward, shuffling trot. It was this knowledge that had turned her away from the old village toward which she had been traveling since she lost Thandar's trail, and sent her in search of a new country, in which she might lose herself from Flatfoot. As the man dragged her roughly on through the grass, Nadara racked her brain for some means of escape, or a way to end her misery before the beast could have his way with her. But there came no ray of hope to her poor, unhappy heart. If Thandar were but there, he would save her, even if it were but to desert her the next instant. But did she wish to be saved again by him? Now that she pondered the idea, she was quite sure that she would rather die than see him again, for had he not twice run away from her? In her misery, she put this interpretation upon the remarkable disappearance of Thandar after his battle with Korth. He had waited until she was out of sight, and then he had risen and fled for fear she might return and discover him. She wondered why he should dislike her so much. She was quite sure that she had been very good to him, and had tried not to annoy him while they were together. Maybe he looked down upon her, for surely he was of a superior race. Of that she was quite positive. And so Nadara was very miserable and unhappy and hopeless as the brutal Flatfoot dragged her far into the tall jungle grass. Presently she noticed that the caveman repeatedly cast glances toward the rear. What could he expect from that direction, or from any direction whatever, so far as that was concerned? Were they not days and days from their own people, in a land where there seemed no men at all? Flatfoot heard no sign of pursuit. He was growing more confident. The stranger had lost their trail. The caveman moved less rapidly, and as he went he looked now for a burrow into which he might crawl with the maiden. Then there would be no further danger whatever. Tomorrow Flatfoot would come out and find the fellow and kill him. But now he had pleasanter work in view, nor did he wish to be disturbed. And at that very moment he caught a stealthy movement in the grasses a few yards to his right. Waldo had come upon the spot at which Flatfoot had overtaken Nadara but a few minutes after the brute had dragged her away, and on the instant had sought a higher piece of ground from which he could overlook the tall grass. Nor had he been long in finding a spot that, coupled with his 6 feet 2, brought his eyes above the level of the surrounding jungle. There he watched for a little until he discerned a movement of the grass-tops at a little distance from him. After that it was but a matter of trailing. When Flatfoot saw what he took to be his enemy, he threw Nadara across his shoulder and started on a run in the opposite direction, at right angles to the way he had been going. The ruse proved good, for when Waldo came to the point at which he had figured his path would cross the caveman's, he found no sign of the latter, and in searching about to locate the trail, lost many minutes of valuable time. But at last he came upon that which he sought, and with redoubled speed set out at a rapid run through the tall grasses. He had proceeded but a short distance when the trail broke suddenly into the open, close by the base of the cliffs that he had seen from the hill that had given him his fleeting glimpse of Nadara. Ahead of him he saw the two he sought, Nadara across the burly shoulders of Flatfoot, and the caveman was making for the caves that dotted the face of the cliff. Were he to reach these, he might defend one of them against a single antagonist indefinitely. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Of the Cave Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 11. Capture. Almost at the moment that Waldo emerged from the jungle, Nadara saw him, and with a lunge threw herself from Flatfoot's shoulder. The man turned with a fierce growl of rage, and his eyes fell upon the giant rushing toward them. The girl was now struggling madly to escape or delay her captor. There could be but one outcome, as Flatfoot knew. He must fight now, but the girl should never escape him. Raising the huge fist that had killed many a full-grown man with a single blow, he aimed a wicked one at the side of Nadara's head. The first one she dodged, and as the arm went up to strike again, Thandar threw his spear-arm far back, and with a mighty forward surge drove his light weapon across the 100 feet that separated him from Flatfoot. It was an awful risk. There was not a foot to spare between the hairy breast that was his target and the beautiful head of the fair captive. Should either move between the time the spear left his hand and the instant that it found its mark, it might pierce the one it had been sped to save. Flatfoot's fist was crashing down toward that lovely face at the instant that the spear found him. But he had moved, just enough to place his arm before his breast, so that it was the falling arm that received the weapon instead of the heart that it had been intended for. But it served its purpose. With a howl of pain and rage, Flatfoot, forgetful of the girl in the madness of his anger, dropped her and sprang toward Waldo. The latter had drawn his sword, naught but a sharpened stick of hard wood, and stood waiting to receive his foe. It was his first attempt to put either sword or shield into practical use, and he was anxious to discover their value. As Flatfoot came toward his antagonist, he pulled the spear from the muscles of his arm, and stooping, gathered up one of the many rocks that lay scattered about at the base of the cliff. The caveman was roaring like a mad bull. Hate and murder shot from his close-set eyes. His upper lip curled back, showing his fighting fangs, and a light froth flecked his bristling beard. Waldo was sure there had never existed a more fearsome creature, and he marveled that he was not afraid. The very thought of what the effect of this terrible monster's mad charge would have been upon him a short while ago brought a smile to his lips. At sight of that taunting smile, Flatfoot hurled a rock full at the maddening face. With a quick movement of his left arm, Waldo caught the missile on his buckler, from whence it dropped harmlessly to the ground. Flatfoot did not throw again, and an instant later he was upon the Bostonian, the pride and hope of the cultured and aristocratic Back Bay Smith-Joneses. When he reached for the agile blond giant, he found a thin sheet of hide-covered twigs in his way, and when he tried to tear down this barrier, the point of a sharpened stick was thrust into his abdomen. This was no way to fight. Flatfoot was scandalized. He jumped back a few feet and glared at Waldo. Then he lowered his head and came at him once more with a very evident intention of rushing him off his feet by the very weight and impetuosity of his charge. This time the sharp stick slipped quickly over the top of the hide-covered atrocity and pierced Flatfoot's neck just where it joined his thick skull. Bearing a foot of its point beneath the muscles of the shoulder, it brought a scream of pain and rage from the hairy beast. Before Waldo could withdraw his weapon from the tough sinews, Flatfoot had straightened up with a sudden jerk that snapped the sword short, leaving but a short stub in his antagonist's hand. Nadara had been watching the battle breathlessly, ready to flee should it turn against her champion, yet at the same time searching for an opportunity to aid him. Like Flatfoot, the girl had never before seen spear or sword or shield in use, and while she marveled at the advantage which they gave Thandar, she became dubious as to the result of the encounter when she saw the sword broken, for the spear had been snapped into kindling wood by Flatfoot when he tore it from his arm. But Waldo still had his cudgel, fastened by a thong to his sword-belt, and as the caveman rushed upon him again, he swung a mighty blow to the low, brutal forehead. Momentarily stunned, The fellow reeled backward for a step, and again Waldo wielded his new weapon. Flatfoot trembled. His knees smote together. He staggered drunkenly, and then, when Waldo looked to see him go down, the brute power that was in him, responding to nature's first law, sent him hurtling at the Bostonian's throat in the snarling, blind rage of the death-smitten beast. Catapulted by all the enormous strength of his mighty muscles, the squat, bear-like animal bore Waldo to earth, and at the same instant each found the other's throat with sinewy, vice-like fingers. They lay very still now, choking with firm, relentless clutch. Every ounce of muscle was needed, every grain of endurance. Waldo was suffering agonies after a moment of that awful death grip. He could feel his grasping, pain-racked lungs struggling for air. He tried to wriggle free from those horrible fingers, but not once did he loosen his own hold upon the throat of Flatfoot. Instead, he tried to close a little tighter each second that he felt his own life ebbing. He became weaker and weaker. The pain was unendurable now. A haze obscured his vision. Everything became black. His brain was whizzing about at frightful velocity within the awful darkness of his skull. The girl was bending close above them now, for both were struggling less violently. She had been minded to come to Thandar's rescue when suddenly she recalled his desertion of her, and all the wild hatred of the primitive mind surged through her. Let him die, she thought. He had spurned her, cast her off. He looked down upon her. Well, let him take care of himself then, and she turned deliberately away to leave the two men to decide the outcome of their own battle, and started back upon the trail in the direction of her tribe's village. But she had taken scarce a score of steps when something flamed up in her heart that withered the last remnant of her malice toward Thandar. As she turned back again toward the combatants, she attempted to justify this new weakness by the thought that it was only fair that she should give the Yellow One aid in return for the aid that he had rendered her. That done, she could go on her way with a clear conscience. She wished never to see him again, but she could not have his blood upon her hands. At that thought she gave a little cry and ran to where the men lay. Both were almost quiet now. Their struggles had nearly ceased. Just as she reached them, Flatfoot relaxed. His hand slipped from Waldo's throat, and he lay entirely motionless. Then the fair giant struggled convulsively once or twice. He gasped, his eyes rolled up and set, and with a sudden twitching of his muscles he stiffened rigidly and was very still. Nadara gave one horrified look at the ghastly face of her champion and fled into the jungle. She stumbled on for a quarter of a mile as fast as her tired limbs would carry her through the entangling grasses, and then she came to that which she sought, a little stream, winding slowly through the valley down toward the ocean. Dropping to her knees beside it, she filled her mouth with the refreshing water. In an instant she was up again and off in the direction from which she had just come. Throwing herself at Waldo's side, she wet his face with the water from her mouth. She chafed his hands, shook him, blew upon his face when the water was exhausted, and then, tears streaming from her eyes, she threw herself upon him, covering his face with kisses, and moaning inarticulate words of love and endearment that were half stifled by the anguished sobs of grief. Suddenly her lamentations ceased as quickly as they had begun. She raised her head from where it had been buried beside the man's and looked intently into his face. Then she placed her ear upon his breast. With a delighted cry, she resumed chafing his hands, for she had heard the beating of his heart. Presently Waldo gasped, and for a moment suffered the agonies of returning respiration. When he opened his eyes in consciousness, he saw Nadara bending over him, a severely disinterested expression upon her beautiful face. He turned his head to one side. There lay Flatfoot, quite dead. It was several moments before he could speak. Then he rose, very unsteadily, to his feet. "Nadara," he said, "Korth lies dead beside the 3 great trees in the glade that is near the village that was Flatfoot's. Here is the dead body of Flatfoot, and about my loins hangs the pelt of Nagula, taken in fair fight. I have done all that you desired of me. I have tried to repay you for your kindness to me when I was a stranger in your land. I do not know why you should have tried to kill me while I battled with Korth. No more do I know why you have allowed me to live today, when it would have been so easy to have dispatched me as I lay unconscious here beside Flatfoot. I read dislike upon your face, and I am sorry, for I would have parted with you in friendship, so that when the time comes that I return to my own land, I should be able to carry away with me only the pleasant memory of it. When we have rested and are refreshed, I shall take you back to your father." All that had been surging to the girl's lips of love and gratitude from a heart that was filled with both was congealed by the cold tone which marked this dispassionate recital of the discharge of a moral obligation. Possibly Waldo's tone was colored by the vivid memory of the look of hate that he had seen in the girl's eyes at the instant that he went down before her missile as he battled with Korth, for it was not even tinged with friendliness. And so the girl's manner was equally distant when she replied. In fact, it was even colder, for it was fraught with bitterness. "Thandar owed nothing to Nadara," she said, "and though it matters not at all, it is only fair to say that the stone that struck you as you battled in the glade was intended for Korth." Waldo's face brightened. A load that he had not realized lay there was lifted from his heart. "You did not want to hurt me, then?" he cried. "Why should I want to hurt you?" returned the girl. "I thought—" And here Waldo spoiled the fair start they had made at a reconciliation. "I thought," he said, "that you were angry because I ran away from you after we had come to your village that time, months ago." Nadara's head went high, and she laughed aloud. "I angry? I was surprised that you did not come to the village, but after an hour I had forgotten the matter. It was with difficulty that I recognized you when I next saw you, so utterly had the occurrence departed from my thoughts." Waldo wondered why he should feel such humiliation at this frank avowal. Of what moment to him was this girl's estimation of him? Why did he feel a flush suffuse his face at the knowledge that he was of so little moment to her that she had entirely forgotten him within a few months? Waldo was mortified and angry. He changed the subject brusquely. Hereafter he should eschew personalities. "Let us find a cave at a distance from the dead man," he said, "and there we may rest until you are ready to attempt the return journey." "I am ready now," replied Nadara, "nor do I need or desire your company. I can return alone as I came." "No," remonstrated Waldo doggedly. "I shall go with you whether you wish it or not. I shall see you safely with your father. I promised him." Nadara had been delighted with the first clause of his reply, but when it became evident that his only desire to return with her was to fulfill a promise made her father, she became furious, though she was careful not to let him see it. "Very well," she replied. "You may come if you wish, though it is neither necessary nor as I would have it. I prefer being alone." "I shall not force my company upon you," said Waldo haughtily. "I can follow a few paces behind you." There was an injured air in his last words which did not escape the girl. She wondered if he really deserved the harsh attitude she had maintained. They found a cave a half-mile down the valley, where they took up their quarters against the time that Waldo should be rested, for the girl insisted that she was fully able to commence the return journey at once. The man knew better, and so he let her have it that the delay was on his account rather than hers, for he doubted her ability to cope with the hardships of the long journey without an interval for recuperation. The next morning found them both rested and in better spirits, so that there was no return to their acrimonious encounter of the previous day. As they walked out toward the forest that lay down the valley in the direction of the ocean, Waldo dropped a few paces behind the girl in polite deference to her expressed wish of the day before. As he walked, he watched the graceful movements of her lithe figure, and the lines of her clear-cut profile as she turned her head this way and that in search of food. How beautiful she was! It was incredible that this wild cave-girl should have greater beauty and a more regal carriage than the queens and beauties of civilization, and yet Waldo was forced to admit that he had never even dreamed, much less seen, such absolute physical perfection. He wished that he could say as much for her disposition. That was atrocious. It was unbelievable that such a wondrous exterior could harbor so much ingratitude and coldness. Presently they came among the trees where the ripe fruit hung, and as Waldo climbed nimbly among the branches and tossed the most luscious down to her, the girl, in her turn, watched him. She noted more closely the marvelous change that a few months had wrought. She had thought him wonderful before, but now he was a very god. She did not think just this, for she knew nothing of gods, other than the demons that were supposed to enter the bodies of the sick. But she thought of him as some superior creature, and then she ceased to feel aggrieved that he should care so little for her. He was not a man. He was something more than a man, and she had been very wicked to have treated him so shamefully. She would make amends. She would try to be more kind thereafter, though there still remained a trace of aloofness. Together they sat upon the turf and ate their fruit, and as they ate they talked a little, for it is difficult for two young people to harbor animosity for a great time, especially when there is none other for them to talk to. "When you have returned with me to my father, Thandar," the girl asked, "where shall you go then?" "I shall return to the sea, where I may watch for a ship to take me back to my own land," he replied. "I have seen but one ship in all my life," said Nadara, "and that was years ago. It was when we lived close by the big water that it stopped a long way from shore and sent many smaller boats to land. There were many men in the boats, and when they landed, my father and mother took me far into the forest away from the sea, and there we stayed for many days until the strangers had sailed. They wandered up and down the coast and came back into the forests and the jungles for a few miles. My mother said that they were searching for me, and that if they found me they would take me away. I was very much frightened." At the mention of her mother, Waldo recalled the little parcel that Nadara's father had given into his custody for the girl. He unfastened it from the thong that circled his waist, where it had hung beneath his panther-skin garment. "Here is something your father asked me to bring you," he said, handing the package to Nadara. The girl took it and examined it as though it was entirely unfamiliar. "What is it?" she asked. "Your father did not say, other than it contained articles that your mother wore when she died," he said tenderly, for a great pity had welled up in his heart for this poor, motherless girl. "That my mother wore," Nadara repeated, her brows contracted in a puzzled frown. "When my mother died, she wore nothing but a single garment of many small skins, very old and worn, and that was buried with her. I do not understand." She made no effort to open the package, but sat gazing far off toward the ocean, which was just visible through the trees, entirely absorbed in the reverie which Waldo's words had engendered. "Could the thing that the old woman told me have been true?" The girl mused half aloud. "Could it have been because it was true that my mother fell upon her with tooth and nail until she had nearly killed her? I wonder if—" But here she stopped, her eyes riveted in sudden fear and hopelessness upon a thing that she just espied in the distance. A great lump rose in her throat, tears came to her eyes, and with them the full measure of realization of what that thing beyond the forest meant to her. She turned her eyes toward the man. He was sitting with bowed head, playing idly with a large beetle that he had pinned within a tiny palisade of small twigs. At length he made an opening in the barrier. "Go your way, poor thing," he murmured, Heaven knows I realize too well the horrors of captivity to keep any other creature from its fellows and its home." A choking sigh that was almost a sob racked the girl. At the sound, Waldo looked up to see her pathetic, unhappy eyes upon him. Of a sudden, there enveloped him a great desire to take her in his arms and comfort her. He knew not why she was unhappy, but her sorrow cried aloud to him, as he thought simply to the protective instinct that was merely an attribute of his sex. Nadara raised her hand slowly and pointed through the trees. It was as though she had torn her heart from her breast, so harrowing she felt the consequences of her act would be, but it was for his sake, for the sake of the man she loved. As Waldo's eyes followed the direction of her pointing finger, he came suddenly to his feet with a wild cry of joy. Through the trees, out upon the shimmering surface of the placid sea, there lay a graceful white yacht. "Thank God!" cried the man fervently, and sinking to his knees he raised his hands aloft toward the author of joy and sorrow. A moment later he sprang to his feet. "Home, Nadara, home!" he cried. "Can't you realize it? I am going home. I am saved. Oh, Nadara, child, can't you realize what it means to me? Home, home, home!" He had been looking toward the yacht as he spoke, but now he turned toward the girl. She was crouching upon the ground, her face in her hands, her slender figure shaken by convulsive tears. He came toward her, and kneeling, laid his hand upon her shoulder. "Nadara," he said gently, "why do you cry, child? What is the matter?" But she only shook her head, moaning. He raised her to her feet, and as he supported her his arm circled her shoulders. "Tell me, Nadara, why are you unhappy?" he urged. But still she could not speak for sobbing, and only buried her face upon his breast. He was holding her very close now, and with the pressure of her body against his, a fire that, unknown, had been smoldering in his heart for months burst into sudden flame, and in the heat of it there were consumed the mists that had been before his eyes of his heart all that time. "Nadara?" he asked in a very low voice. "Is it because I am going that you cry?" But at that she pulled away from him, and through her tears her eyes blazed. "No," she cried, "I shall be glad when you have gone. I wish that you had never come. I hate you." She turned and fled back up the valley, forgetful of the little packet Thandar had brought her, which lay forgotten upon the ground where she had dropped it. Without so much as a backward glance toward the yacht, Waldo was off in pursuit of her. But Nadara was fleet as a hare, so that it was a much-winded Waldo who finally overhauled her halfway up the face of a cliff 2 miles from the ocean. "Go away!" cried the girl. "Go back with your own kind, to your home!" Waldo did not answer. Waldo was no more. It was Thandar, the caveman, who took Nadara in his strong arms and crushed her to him. "My girl," he cried, "my girl! I love you, and because I am a fool I did not learn until it was almost too late." He did not ask if she loved him, for he was Thandar, the caveman. Nor, a moment later, did he need to ask, since her strong brown arms crept up about his neck and drew his lips down to hers. It was quite half an hour later before either thought of the yacht again. From where they stood upon the cliff's face, they could see the ocean and the beach. Several boats were drawn up, and a number of men were coming toward the forest. Presently they would discover the two upon the cliff. "We shall go back together now," said Thandar. "I am afraid," replied Nadara. For a time the man stood gazing at the dainty yacht, and far beyond it into the civilization which it represented, and he saw there suave men and sneering women, and among them was a slender brown beauty who shrank from the cruel glances of the women. And Waldo writhed at this and at the greedy eyes of the suave men as they appraised the girl, and he too was afraid. "Come," he said, taking Nadara by the hand. "Let us hurry back into the hills before they discover us." Just as the men from the yacht, which Mr. John Alden Smith-Jones had dispatched to the South Seas in searching of his missing son, emerged from the forest into a view of the valley and the cliffs, a man and his mate clambered over the brow of the ladder and disappeared toward the hills beyond. It was nearly dusk as the searchers from the yacht were returning toward the beach. They had found no sign of human habitation in the little valley, nor anywhere along the coast they had so carefully explored. The commander of the expedition, Captain Cecil Burlingame, a retired naval officer, was in advance. They had penetrated the woods nearly to the beach when his foot struck against a package wrapped in the skin of a small rodent. He stooped and picked it up. "Here is the first evidence that another human being than ourselves has ever set foot upon this island," he said as he cut the gut lacing with his pocket-knife. Within the first wrapping he found a chamois bag such as women sometimes use to carry jewels about their persons. From this he emptied into his palm a dozen priceless rings, a few old-fashioned brooches, bracelets and lockets. In one of the latter he discovered the ivory miniature of a woman, a very beautiful woman. In the other side of the locket was engraved, "To Eugenie Marie Celeste de la Valois, Countess of Crécy, from Henri, her husband, 17th January, 18—" "Gad!" cried the old captain. "Now what do you make of that?" "The Count and Countess of Crécy were returning to Paris from their honeymoon trip round the world in the steam yacht Dolphin nearly 20 years ago, and after they touched at Australia were never heard of again. What tragedy, what mystery, what romance might not these sparkling gems disclose, had they but tongues?" End of Chapter 11. The End of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs.